Welcome to MurderLullaby. If sleep feels far away tonight, let me tell you a story. One written in code, in silence, and in fear. It's a story about messages carved into the dark. About a voice that spoke in riddles, and a city that listened too closely. Tonight we travel back to Northern California, a time of peace and unrest, of long drives, dim streetlights, and letters that arrived with no return address. So take a breath, dim the lights. Let the night settle around you like a quiet secret. And if this story keeps you company, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone else who listens when the world is silent. Now let's begin. The summer of 1968 hung over Northern California like a held breath. In the valleys between San Francisco and Sacramento, the air shimmered with heat during the day, then cooled to perfection as evening fell. Young people drove with their windows down, radio stations playing The Doors and Aretha Franklin into the warm darkness. Life moved at the pace of sunset, unhurried, golden, full of promise. The Bay Area in 1968 was a place of contradiction. In San Francisco, the summer of love had given way to a harder reality. Flower children discovering that peace and love couldn't pay rent, that communes could breed their own kinds of darkness. But in the smaller cities surrounding the Bay, in places like Vallejo and Benicia, life maintained a different rhythm. These were working towns, naval towns, places where people still believed in the American dream, even as that dream was being questioned elsewhere. In Vallejo, a small city nestled along the Carquinez Strait, the water caught the last light of day like scattered coins. The Mare Island Naval Shipyard employed thousands, their shifts beginning and ending with a precision that gave structure to the entire community. Children knew when their fathers would be home by the sound of the shift whistle. Wives timed dinners to that whistle. The whole town breathed in rhythm with the shipyard, a dependable pattern that had persisted through 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts. Teenagers knew all the quiet places where you could park and watch the sun disappear. They knew which roads led to privacy, which turnouts offered the best views of the bay. Lake Herman Road, winding through the hills east of town, was particularly popular. It offered multiple turnouts with panoramic views, places where young couples could escape the watchful eyes of parents and neighbors. These were the innocent secrets of youth. Where to find solitude in a world that suddenly felt too full of noise about war, about change, about tomorrow. The Vietnam War was a constant presence in these communities. Every family knew someone who had been drafted, someone who had come back changed, someone who hadn't come back at all. The nightly news brought images of jungle warfare into living rooms, Walter Cronkite's voice narrating a conflict that seemed both infinitely distant and immediately present. Young men faced decisions that would define their futures. Enlist, wait to be drafted, find a way to college for a deferment, or flee to Canada. Young women watched boyfriends and brothers disappear into uncertainty, some returning with medals, some returning in boxes, some returning with wounds that couldn't be seen but would never heal. Against this backdrop of global uncertainty, local life continued with determined normalcy. High schools held their dances. Drive-in restaurants served hamburgers and milkshakes to carloads of teenagers. The Grove Theater showed the latest films. Churches held their services. People fell in love, got married, had children, built lives. They did all this while shadows gathered at the edges of their vision, while change pressed against the boundaries of their familiar world. David Arthur Faraday was 17 that December, born on October 2nd, 1951, into a solidly middle-class family. His father worked at the shipyard. His mother kept house with the kind of precision that military families often develop. David was an Eagle Scout, an achievement that required years of dedication, dozens of merit badges, a final project that demonstrated leadership and community service. He had chosen to organize a blood drive for the Red Cross, spending weeks coordinating with local officials, recruiting volunteers, managing logistics. The drive had been a success, collecting over 100 pints of blood that might save lives David would never know about. He had the kind of careful precision that math students often carry. every number in its place, every equation balanced. His teachers at Vallejo High School recognized his potential, encouraged him to apply to universities, to consider engineering or mathematics as a career. He kept his textbooks meticulously organized, his notes written in small, neat handwriting that never varied in size or spacing. When he worked on math problems, he would lose himself in the pure logic of numbers, finding in equations a kind of peace that the chaotic world of 1968 couldn't provide. His hair was always neatly combed, a detail his mother took pride in. She had taught him that appearance mattered, that how you presented yourself to the world was a form of respect, for yourself and for others. His clothes were pressed by his mother each morning before school, his shoes polished every Sunday evening while the family watched Ed Sullivan. These rituals provided structure, predictability, a defense against the entropy that seemed to be consuming the wider world. When David smiled, which was often, one corner of his mouth lifted slightly higher than the other, giving him an expression of perpetual gentle amusement. His friends would later remember this asymmetrical smile as his defining feature, the thing that made him recognizably David even from a distance. He wasn't the most popular kid in school, wasn't the star athlete or the class president, but he was liked. He was the kind of person others trusted with secrets, knowing he would keep them. He was the friend you called when you needed help with homework, knowing he would explain patiently without making you feel stupid. Betty Lou Jensen was 16, born on February 6, 1952. She wore her brown hair long and straight, the way all the girls did that year, parted in the middle and falling past her shoulders. She spent considerable time each morning making sure it was perfectly straight, using her mother's iron on the lowest setting, a technique she had learned from 17 magazine. Her mother worried about her damaging her hair, but Betty Lou was careful, methodical, never rushing despite the early morning scramble to get ready for school. She collected stuffed animals. Her room was full of them, arranged on shelves her father had built specially for her collection. The shelves were painted white, running along 3 walls of her bedroom, creating a gallery of soft creatures that watched over her while she slept. She named each one, keeping a small notebook where she recorded their names and the occasions on which she had received them. There was Mr. Buttons, a bear from her 5th birthday. Penelope, a penguin from a trip to the San Francisco Zoo. Chester, a dog that had been her grandmother's last Christmas gift before passing away. She remembered their names even years after receiving them. This attention to small details, this tenderness toward inanimate objects, revealed something essential about her nature. She saw personality in everything. She found reasons to care. When friends teased her about still having stuffed animals at 16, she would smile and change the subject, but she never considered removing them. They were part of her history, each one a marker of love received, of moments worth remembering. Betty Lou was a good student, particularly in English and history. She loved reading, often staying up past her bedtime with a flashlight under the covers, lost in stories of different times and places. Her favorite book was Pride and Prejudice, which she had read 4 times, finding something new in it with each reading. She identified with Elizabeth Bennet, smart, independent, unwilling to settle for less than real love. She had written in her diary that she wanted a love story like Elizabeth's, one built on respect and understanding rather than mere attraction. Her parents, Lauren and Betty Jensen, were protective, but not overly so. They had raised Betty Lou to be responsible, to make good decisions, to trust her judgment while knowing they were always there if she needed them. Lauren worked as a government employee at Mare Island, while Betty maintained their home and was active in the PTA. They were the kind of parents who attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every event where their daughter might need support or witness to her achievements. David and Betty Lou had been dating for just 3 weeks. 3 weeks of phone calls that stretched past bedtime. The long cord of the family phone stretched into David's room, his voice low to avoid waking his parents. They talked about everything and nothing. School gossip, future plans, favorite songs, fears about the world they were inheriting. David would work math problems while they talked, Betty Lou would doodle in the margins of her notebooks, and somehow these parallel activities felt like togetherness. 3 weeks of past notes in hallway moments between classes. David's handwriting was precise and small. Betty Lou's was looping and decorated with small hearts over the eyes. The notes were innocent. Thinking of you. Good luck on your test. You looked pretty today, but they carried the weight of first love, each one saved and reread multiple times. Betty Lou kept hers in a small wooden box on her dresser, tied with a ribbon. David kept his in his wallet, folded carefully to prevent tearing. 3 weeks of that particular electricity that comes with first love, when every song on the radio seems written just for you, when every sunset belongs to your story alone. They had claimed The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel as their song, though neither could have articulated why. Perhaps it was the melancholy beauty of it, the sense that it understood something about the complexity of feeling they were experiencing. When it came on the radio, they would both stop whatever they were doing and listen, knowing the other was probably doing the same. Their relationship was chaste by modern standards, but intense in the way that first loves often are. They held hands with an awareness of every point of contact. A kiss on the cheek could sustain days of daydreaming. They were learning each other slowly, carefully, with the patience that comes from believing you have all the time in the world. On December 20th, 1968, the air was crisp but not cold, the kind of California winter evening that makes you grateful to live in a place where seasons are suggestions rather than mandates. The temperature was around 45 degrees, cool enough to need a jacket, but not so cold as to discourage going out. The sky was clear, stars visible despite the ambient light from the city, the kind of night that seemed designed for romance. Betty Lou told her parents she was going to a Christmas concert at Hogan High School. It wasn't exactly a lie. There was a concert, and they had initially planned to attend. She had dressed carefully for the evening, wearing a purple dress with white trim that her mother had helped her pick out the previous weekend. She had curled the ends of her hair slightly, applied just enough makeup to enhance without looking like she was trying too hard. She wanted to look nice for David, to be the kind of girlfriend he could be proud to be seen with. David picked her up at 8 o'clock precisely. He was never late, a trait that Betty Lou's parents appreciated. He came to the door, spoke politely with her parents, complimented Mrs. Jensen on the Christmas decorations she had put up that afternoon. He was wearing dark slacks and a button-up shirt, his good shoes polished to a shine. He looked older than 17, carried himself with a dignity that suggested the man he was becoming. Her father, Lauren, watched from the window as she got into David's brown 1961 Rambler station wagon. It was an old car, but well-maintained. David, having spent weekends with his father, learning basic maintenance, checking oil, rotating tires, all the small acts of care that keep a machine running. The car's taillights disappeared around the corner, 2 red points of light fading into the greater darkness of the street. It was 8:20 p.m. Lauren would remember the exact time because he had just checked his watch, a habit from his military days that he never lost. They never made it to the concert. The decision to skip the concert was spontaneous, mutual, the kind of small rebellion that feels momentous when you're 17 and 16. They wanted to be alone, to talk without the noise of a concert, to have time that belonged only to them. David suggested they drive out to Lake Herman Road, a spot he knew from previous visits with friends. Betty Lou agreed, trusting David, trusting the night, trusting that the world was fundamentally safe for 2 young people in love. Instead, they drove out Lake Herman Road, a winding stretch that connected Vallejo to Benicia. The road was built in the 1920s, originally a simple farm road that had been paved and widened as the area developed. It curved through rolling hills covered with dry grass that turned golden in summer and green in winter. Oak trees dotted the landscape, their branches creating shadows that danced across the road in the headlights of passing cars. The road was known to local teenagers as a safe place for privacy. It offered pull-offs with views of the surrounding hills, places where you could stop and talk without the eyes of the town upon you. The unwritten rules were understood. You didn't bother other cars, you didn't make too much noise, you left before the sheriff's deputies made their routine patrols. It was a place for innocent romance, for conversations that felt too important for ordinary locations, for the kind of privacy that teenagers in small towns have to actively seek. David and Betty Lou weren't doing anything wrong. They were simply young, seeking a moment of privacy in a world that watched teenagers with suspicious eyes. The moral panic about youth culture was at its peak in 1968. Adults worried about drugs, about loose morals, about the breakdown of traditional values. Parents who had come of age during the Depression and World War II struggled to understand children who questioned authority, who grew their hair long, who listened to music that sounded like noise. David and Betty Lou were not part of the counterculture. They were conventional kids from conventional families, but they still felt the weight of adult anxiety about what teenagers might do if left unsupervised. They parked in a gravel turnout near a pump house, about 2.5 miles from the main road. The pump house was a small concrete structure that housed equipment for the Humble Oil Company, which had a pipeline running through the area. The spot was familiar to David. He'd been there before with friends, just talking, just being 17 in a world that demanded you grow up too fast, but didn't quite trust you with adult freedoms. The turnout was shaped like a comma, allowing cars to pull completely off the road. Gravel had been laid down to prevent cars from getting stuck in the mud during winter rains. A fence ran along one side, separating the road from grazing land where cattle sometimes wandered. The spot offered a view of the valley below, lights from distant farms creating constellations on the ground that mirrored the stars above. David parked facing the road, the car's engine ticking as it cooled. The radio played softly, KA or KFRC, the AM stations that provided the soundtrack to Bay Area youth. The heater was on, fighting off the chill that crept in through the car's old weather stripping. Through the windshield, they could see the distant lights of Vallejo, like a constellation that had fallen to Earth. The city looked different from this distance, smaller, more manageable, less complicated. They talked. About what? We can only imagine. Perhaps about Christmas plans. It was only 5 days away. Perhaps about their future, the colleges David was considering, whether their relationship could survive separation. Perhaps about nothing important at all, the kind of comfortable conversation that marks the transition from infatuation to something deeper. The windows began to fog from their breath, creating a cocoon of privacy, separating them from the world outside. Pause here. Breathe in the stillness of that moment. Two young people sitting in a car, their whole lives stretching ahead like an unwritten book. David had college applications on his desk at home, was waiting to hear from UC Davis and Cal Poly. Betty Lou had 2 more years of high school, was thinking about becoming a teacher, had recently written in her diary about wanting to make a difference in the world. Think about all the December nights you've known, the particular quality of darkness in winter, how it feels heavier somehow, more complete. The winter darkness of Northern California has a quality different from other places. It's not the bitter darkness of northern winters, nor the humid darkness of the South. It's a soft darkness, a darkness that feels like velvet, that invites you to disappear into it. They were surrounded by that darkness, but they weren't afraid. Why would they be? This was their town. These were their roads. The night belonged to them. At approximately 10:15 p.m., a car approached from behind. Its headlights swept across the Rambler's interior, illuminating David and Betty Lou for a moment before passing. The light would have been blinding after their eyes had adjusted to the darkness, turning everything into sharp contrasts of light and shadow. But the car didn't continue on. It stopped. The reverse lights came on. It backed up, pulled alongside them. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes other couples would pull into the same area, realize it was occupied, and leave to find another spot. Sometimes it was friends recognizing David's car, stopping to say hello. Sometimes it was the sheriff's department, checking to make sure everyone was okay, suggesting it might be time to head home. David probably wasn't immediately alarmed. This was 1968 in small-town California. The The world hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers in the way it would soon learn. What happened next would take only minutes. But those minutes would echo through decades, rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. They would change how parents viewed their children's safety, how teenagers thought about privacy, how an entire region understood the nature of random violence. The stranger ordered them out of the car. The exact words are unknown. David and Betty Lou would never have the chance to report them. But the result was clear. David began to comply. His hand was on the door handle when the first shot came. The bullet entered through the right side of his head, behind his ear. The muzzle flash would have been brilliant in the darkness, a moment of terrible illumination. The sound would have been enormous in the confined space, possibly damaging Betty Lou's hearing in her last moments of life. Betty Lou tried to run. The door on her side was already open. Perhaps she had opened it when ordered to. Perhaps she had been trying to leave even before the shooting started. She made it 28 feet from the car. 28 feet of terror in the darkness. 28 feet measured later by investigators with the kind of precision that tries to impose order on chaos. Her path was marked by scuff marks in the gravel, by drops of blood that looked black in the investigators' flashlights. She was shot 5 times in the back. The pattern of wounds suggested the shooter was skilled, grouping the shots in a tight pattern despite shooting at a moving target in darkness. She fell face down on the cold ground, her purple dress spread around her like spilled wine. Her hand was outstretched, fingers clawed into the gravel, as if she had been trying to pull herself forward even as life left her body. David was shot once more as he lay slumped in the car. A second bullet to the head, what investigators would call a insurance shot, making sure the victim was dead. But David wasn't dead. The bullets had somehow missed the vital centers of his brain. He was unconscious, bleeding profusely, but his heart continued to beat. His body continued its automatic functions, unaware that everything had changed, that Betty Lou was lying in the gravel, that their story had been violently edited to an ending neither of them could have imagined. The shooter left no evidence except shell casings. 10 .22 caliber long rifle rounds scattered on the ground, their brass catching moonlight like terrible jewelry. No footprints clear enough to cast, no tire tracks distinct enough to identify a vehicle. Just 2 teenagers, one dead, one dying, and a silence that seemed to press in from all directions. At approximately 11:10 p.m., Stella Borges was driving home from Benicia with her teenage son. The road was dark, empty, the kind of quiet that made you want to drive faster to get home sooner. As they passed the pump house turnout, her headlights caught something that made her slow down. A car parked at an odd angle, the passenger door standing open, the dome light on, creating a sphere of yellow light in the darkness. Something about the scene felt wrong. Cars parked here weren't unusual, but the open door, the angle of the car, something indefinable but unmistakably off. She drove on, uneasy but unsure. This was 1968. You didn't immediately assume violence. You minded your own business. You didn't insert yourself into situations that might be embarrassing misunderstandings. But the image stayed with her as she drove. The open door, the light, the stillness of it. Minutes later, she convinced herself to turn around. She convinced her son, despite his protests, that it was probably nothing, probably just kids, probably none of their business. They returned to the scene. As they approached, their headlights revealed more details. A figure on the ground near the car, another figure slumped inside, no movement, no sound except their own engine. Stella told her son to stay in the car, but he got out anyway. Together, they approached the scene with the kind of reluctance that comes from knowing you're about to discover something that will change you. They found David and Betty Lou. David was still breathing, shallow gasps that created small clouds of vapor in the cold air. Blood covered the right side of his head, had pooled on the seat beneath him. Betty Lou was face down in the gravel, absolutely still. Stella knew without checking that the girl was dead. There was a quality to the stillness, an absence that was unmistakable even to someone who had never encountered violent death before. They didn't have a way to call for help. This was before cell phones, before emergency call boxes on remote roads. They had to make a terrible decision: stay with the victims or leave to find help. They chose to leave, racing toward Benicia, looking for a phone, a police station, anyone who could help. They found a gas station, still open despite the late hour. The attendant called the police while Stella tried to explain what they had found, her words tumbling over each other, unable to capture the horror of it. The first officers arrived at 11:25 p.m. Officer Pierre Bidou of the Benicia Police Department was first on scene. He would later describe the moment of arriving, how his headlights swept across the scene, revealing it in stages like a terrible play. The car, the open door, the girl on the ground, the boy in the car still breathing but unresponsive. The shell casings glittering in his flashlight beam like brass tears. David was still alive when the ambulance arrived. The paramedics worked with desperate efficiency, trying to stabilize him for transport. His pulse was weak but present. His breathing was labored but continuing. There was hope, however slim, that he might survive, might be able to tell them what happened, who did this, why. They loaded him into the ambulance, the driver taking the curves of Lake Herman Road as fast as he dared, trying to balance speed with keeping David stable. He died on the way to the hospital, never regaining consciousness, never able to say what he had seen. The exact time of death was recorded as 12:05 December 21st. He had survived for nearly 2 hours after being shot, his body fighting to continue even as his brain shut down. The doctors who received him at the hospital would say there was never really any hope. The damage was too severe. But everyone involved in trying to save him would wonder what might have been different if they had found him sooner. Betty Lou was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner would determine she had died quickly, probably within a minute of being shot. It was a small mercy in an act devoid of mercy. She hadn't suffered long, but she had suffered. She had known terror in her last moments, had tried to run, had fallen knowing that David was behind her in the car, probably already shot. Her last conscious thought was probably of him, wondering if he was alive, if he might somehow escape. The police arrived to find a scene that was both violent and oddly precise. The shell casings formed a pattern that suggested the shooter had stood in one place while firing at Betty Lou, had been calm enough to track her movement and adjust his aim. This wasn't panic shooting. This was deliberate, controlled, practiced. Someone who was comfortable with a weapon, who didn't let adrenaline affect their accuracy. The car was undisturbed beyond the violence done to David. Nothing stolen. David's wallet was still in his pocket, containing $12. Betty Lou's purse was still in the car, her student ID and lipstick, and the small amount of money she carried all accounted for. The radio was still on, playing to an empty car, love songs continuing after love had been murdered. This wasn't robbery. This was something else. Something without a name yet, without a shape that anyone could recognize. The investigation began immediately. Detectives from multiple jurisdictions converged on the scene. Solano County Sheriff's Department, because the crime occurred in their jurisdiction. Benicia Police, because they were first responders. Vallejo Police, because the victims were from their city. The California Highway Patrol, because the crime occurred on a road they regularly patrolled. This multi-jurisdictional response would become a complicating factor, with different agencies having different procedures, different theories, different levels of investment in solving the case. Think about how mysteries begin, not with answers, but with questions that multiply in the darkness. Who would do this? Why these two young people? Why here, on this quiet road where teenagers had been parking safely for years? The investigators stood in the cold December night, their flashlight beams crossing and recrossing the gravel, searching for something, anything that might make sense of the senseless. They found so little: the shell casings, which told them the caliber of weapon, but little else. .22 long rifle was one of the most common ammunition types in America, used for target shooting, small game hunting, plinking cans in backyards. Thousands of guns in the Bay Area could fire such rounds. The lack of distinctive markings on the casings suggested a common manufacturer, nothing special or traceable. They photographed everything, The position of the bodies, the pattern of shell casings, the tire marks, though none were clear enough to identify a specific vehicle. They measured distances, from the car to Betty Lou's body, from where the shooter probably stood to where David sat. They created a geometry of death, trying to understand the physics of violence, as if understanding the how might reveal the why. The detectives interviewed everyone they could find who had been on Lake Herman Road that night. A few other couples had been parked in different turnouts, but none had seen or heard anything unusual until they heard sirens and left. The sound of gunshots might have been muffled by the hills, or might have been dismissed as someone target shooting, even at night. This was rural enough that gunfire wasn't automatically assumed to be violence. The town of Vallejo woke the next morning to news that would change the texture of their daily lives. The Vallejo Times-Herald ran the story on the front page. Young couple shot on Lake Herman Road. The article was careful, factual, avoiding sensationalism, but the facts themselves were sensational enough. 2 teenagers, good kids from good families, murdered for no apparent reason on a road everyone knew, everyone had driven. Parents who had previously given their teenagers the keys without a second thought now hesitated. Conversations that had been theoretical became immediate. How late is too late? Which places are safe? Who can be trusted? The familiar roads, the ones everyone had driven 1,000 times, suddenly seemed to harbor new shadows. Lake Herman Road, in particular, became a place to avoid after dark. Its curves and turnouts transformed from romantic to sinister in the public imagination. At Hogan High School, where Betty Lou had been a junior, grief counselors were brought in. Her empty desk became a shrine of sorts. Students leaving flowers, notes, small remembrances. Her friends struggled to process the loss, to understand how someone could be there on Friday and gone forever by Monday. The stuffed animals in her room at home sat waiting for an owner who would never return, their button eyes reflecting a world that had become incomprehensible. At Vallejo High School, David's absence was equally felt. His calculus teacher kept expecting him to raise his hand with a question or insight. His Eagle Scout troop held a memorial service, his fellow scouts forming an honor guard, their uniforms pressed, their faces trying to project strength while processing grief. The blood drive David had organized as his Eagle project had saved lives. Now his own blood soaked into the gravel of Lake Herman Road, unable to be saved by all the good works he had done. But here's what's important to understand. In December of 1968, no one yet knew this was a beginning. They thought it was an ending, tragic, inexplicable, but singular. An isolated horror that would fade with time, becoming another sad story that older residents would occasionally recall. Some theorized it was a jealous ex-boyfriend, though neither David nor Betty Lou had any known enemies. Others suspected it might be related to drugs, though both teenagers were clean-cut kids with no connection to that world. There were whispers about it being a thrill kill, someone who had watched too many violent movies and decided to try it for real. The investigation continued through the winter and spring of 1969. Detectives followed every lead, however thin. They investigated a report of a blue car seen speeding from the area. They looked into a strange man who had been seen at Hogan High School asking about Betty Lou. They checked David's background for any enemies, any conflicts, anything that might explain why someone would want him dead. They found nothing. 2 teenagers with no enemies, no dangerous connections, no reason anyone would want them dead except for the arbitrary decision of a stranger in the darkness. They had no idea that somewhere in the Bay Area, someone was already composing his next move, already imagining his next moment in the darkness. The killer had discovered something on Lake Herman Road, something about himself, about what he was capable of, about what he wanted. He had crossed a line that most humans never approach, and having crossed it once, found it easier to cross again. 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer. The days grew longer, the nights warmer, schools let out. Teenagers reclaimed their freedom, their cars, their music-filled nights. The memory of December had softened, though it never fully disappeared. Parents remained watchful, curfews remained earlier, but life has a way of insisting on normalcy even after trauma. People adapt. They have to. The alternative is to live in constant fear, and that's not living at all. Betty Lou's stuffed animals still sat on their shelves, dust gathering on their synthetic fur. Her parents couldn't bring themselves to remove them, but couldn't bear to clean them either. They existed in a kind of suspended animation, like the grief itself, always present, but not always acute. David's math textbooks remained in his room, bookmarks still holding his place, problems half solved in notebooks that would never be completed. The summer of 1969 arrived with its usual California perfection. The hills turned golden, the dry grass crackling underfoot, the bay sparkled under cloudless skies. Tourism picked up, visitors coming to see the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, all the landmarks that made the Bay Area famous. Life moved forward because it had no choice, time refusing to stop even for grief. On July 4th, 1969, America celebrated its independence with the usual festivities. Fireworks bloomed over San Francisco Bay, each explosion reflected in the water like falling stars. Families gathered in parks and backyards for barbecues, the smell of charcoal and hamburgers mixing with the sulfur scent of firecrackers. Children ran through the streets with sparklers, writing their names in light that disappeared as quickly as it appeared, temporary art that existed only in memory. In Vallejo, a young woman named Darlene Elizabeth Farron was working her shift at Terry's restaurant on Magazine Street. She was 22, though she looked younger, with dark hair that she wore in the bouffant style that was just beginning to go out of fashion. She had been born on March 17, 1947, in Los Angeles, but had moved to Vallejo as a teenager. She was one of those people who seemed to know everyone and whom everyone knew, a natural social connector who collected friends the way others collect photographs. Darlene had lived more in her 22 years than many people do in a lifetime. She had been married to Dean Farron when she was just 18, had a daughter, Dina, now a toddler with her mother's dark hair and infectious smile. The marriage hadn't lasted. Dean was young, unprepared for fatherhood, more interested in cars and parties than responsibilities. They had separated but remained on friendly terms, Dean sometimes watching Dina when Darlene worked. She was dating a young man named Michael Renaud Maggio, who was 19, 4 years younger than her. Michael was quieter than Darlene, more introspective, drawn to her warmth and energy like a moth to flame. He had a twin brother and lived with his parents, worked various jobs but hadn't yet found his direction in life. In Darlene, he found someone who made him feel important, adult, worthy of attention. Their relationship was complicated in ways that relationships often are when there's an age gap and different life experiences. Darlene had a child, an ex-husband, responsibilities that Michael couldn't fully understand. She worked multiple jobs, at Terry's restaurant and at the Pioneer Club on Virginia Street. She was trying to support herself and her daughter, to build a stable life from unstable components. Michael offered escape from these pressures, a return to a simpler time when her biggest worry was what to wear on a date. That 4th of July, Darlene was in good spirits. The restaurant was busy, but not overwhelming, filled with families extending their holiday celebrations over dinner. She joked with customers, remembered regulars' usual orders, moved through the dining room with an efficiency born of experience. Her laugh could fill the room, a genuine sound that made people smile even if they didn't know what had prompted it. She got off work around 10 p.m., the fireworks mostly over, but the night still young. She had made plans with Michael to go out to continue the celebration in their own way. She drove home first to change clothes and check on Dina, who was being watched by a friend. She put on brown slacks and a white blouse with a floral pattern, casual but pretty. She refreshed her makeup, sprayed on perfume, the small rituals of preparing for romance. She picked up Michael around 11:20 p.m. in her brown 1963 Corvair, a car she had recently purchased and was proud of. It wasn't new or fancy, but it was hers, bought with money she had earned herself. The car represented independence, adult achievement, proof that she could take care of herself and her daughter without depending on anyone else. They drove to Mr. Ed's, a drive-in restaurant on Springs Road, but the parking lot was completely full. Cars were lined up waiting for spots. young people not ready for the holiday to end. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the competing sounds of different car radios. They circled the lot once, twice, but no spaces opened up. Darlene suggested Blue Rock Springs Park as an alternative. She knew the place. Everyone in Vallejo knew it. Blue Rock Springs Park was 4 miles from downtown Vallejo, a public park with a golf course, picnic areas, and several parking areas that offered privacy. It was another of those places, like Lake Herman Road, where young couples went to be alone. But it was more developed than Lake Herman Road, closer to town, with better lighting and more traffic. It felt safer, more public, less isolated. They arrived at the park around 11:45 p.m., parking in a lot on the east side, away from the main entrance. There were other cars in the park. 3 teenage boys were in one car, just talking, killing time. Another car held a couple engaged in their own private conversation. It was busy enough to feel safe, empty enough to offer privacy. Darlene parked facing the park's interior, trees visible in the darkness beyond the reach of their headlights. They talked, though what they discussed will never be known. Perhaps about the fireworks they had missed. Perhaps about Darlene's daughter. About Michael's future plans, about the complications of their relationship. The radio played softly, KDIA or KA, the sounds of 1969 filling the car. Aquarius Let the Sunshine In by The Fifth Dimension was huge that summer, its optimistic vision of a new age contrasting sharply with the violence that was about to unfold. Michael would later remember that Darlene seemed nervous, kept checking the mirrors, kept looking around. But memory after trauma is unreliable, often edited by hindsight, by the brain's attempt to make sense of senselessness. Perhaps she was nervous. Perhaps she sensed something. Or perhaps Michael's traumatized brain added that detail later, trying to create warning signs where none existed. At approximately midnight, a car pulled into the lot. It parked about 10 feet away from Darlene's Corvair, sat there for a moment, then left. This wasn't unusual. Cars came and went from the park constantly, people looking for friends, looking for privacy, looking for something to do on a holiday night. But the car bothered Michael. Something about how close it parked, how the driver just sat there, watching them. He mentioned it to Darlene, who told him not to worry about it. 10 minutes later, the car returned. This time, it pulled up behind the Corvair, about 8 feet away, blocking them in. The driver kept his headlights on high beam, flooding Darlene's car with harsh white light. The light was so bright it hurt to look at directly, turning everything inside the car into a study in extreme contrast, blazing white and impenetrable shadow. Michael raised his hand to shield his eyes, trying to see who was in the car, what they wanted. Neither Michael nor Darlene could see the driver clearly because of the blinding headlights. They assumed initially it might be police. The positioning, the use of high beams to illuminate the car's interior, the authoritative way the vehicle had pulled up behind them. It was a standard police technique, one that anyone who had been checked by officers in lovers' lanes would recognize. A figure approached the driver's side window. Michael could only see a silhouette against the brilliant backlighting, a dark shape that moved with purpose. The figure was carrying something, holding it down by his leg. When he reached the window, he raised it, and Michael saw it was a gun. Before either of them could react, before they could scream or duck or drive away, the shooting started. The first shots came through the window at point-blank range. The glass exploded inward in 1,000 pieces, each one catching the light like a terrible prism. The sound in the confined space was enormous, deafening. Michael was hit in the face and neck immediately. Blood filled his mouth, his throat. He couldn't scream, couldn't speak, could only make gurgling sounds as he tried to breathe through the damage. Darlene was shot multiple times in the upper body and arms. She had raised her hands instinctively, trying to protect herself, and several bullets passed through her arms before entering her chest. She screamed, a sound that would haunt Michael for the rest of his life, then slumped over toward him, her weight pressing against his shoulder. The shooter walked calmly back to his car, started the engine, then stopped, turned off the engine, got out, walked back to the Corvair. This is the detail that investigators would puzzle over endlessly. The return. The decision to come back and fire more rounds into two people who were already grievously wounded. It suggested something beyond simple violence. It suggested a need to be thorough, to be certain, to complete something according to an internal logic that only the shooter understood. Or perhaps he had heard Darlene scream and wanted to ensure silence. Or perhaps he simply wanted to inflict more damage, more pain, more death. He fired 2 more shots into Michael, 1 into Darlene. The muzzle flashes lit up the interior of the car like strobing lightning. Then he walked back to his car, started it, and drove away at a normal speed. Not racing, not fleeing in panic. Just driving away like someone leaving a restaurant after dinner, calm and unhurried. Michael, despite his injuries, survived. He would be the only person to survive a confirmed attack by the man who would soon name himself. He played dead as the shooter returned, remaining still even as additional bullets entered his body, even as blood filled his mouth and throat, even as every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, to do something. His jaw was shattered, teeth broken, his tongue nearly severed. Blood was pooling in his throat, threatening to drown him in his own fluids, but he held on to consciousness with a determination that defied medical explanation. 3 teenagers who had been in the park, Jerry, Roger, and Debbie, heard the shots. They counted them, 9 shots total, they thought, though they weren't certain. The shots sounded like firecrackers, they said later, but not quite. There was something too precise about the spacing, too deliberate about the rhythm. Firecrackers came in rapid bursts. These shots were measured, controlled, purposeful. They debated whether to investigate. It was the 4th of July. People had been setting off fireworks all day, but something about the sound, about the location, made them curious. They drove toward where they thought the sound had originated and saw the Corvair with its doors thrown open, the interior light revealing a scene that would be burned into their memories forever. They could see 2 figures slumped in the car, blood visible even from a distance. One of them, Michael, was moving slightly, trying to speak despite his destroyed jaw. He was trying to say something urgent, something important, but the damage to his mouth made words impossible. All that came out were sounds, desperate and unintelligible. The teenagers didn't have a phone, didn't have any way to call for help from the park. They had to make the same terrible decision that Stella Borges had made 6 months earlier: stay with the victims or race for help. They chose to flee, driving at dangerous speeds toward the park entrance where they knew there was a payphone. Roger jumped out before the car had fully stopped, fumbling for change, his fingers shaking as he dialed the operator. The police arrived within minutes. Officers Richard Hoffman and Ed Rust were first on scene, their patrol car sliding to a stop next to the Corvair. They found Darlene unconscious but breathing, making small sounds that might have been attempts at words or just the automatic vocalizations of a body in distress. Michael was conscious, trying desperately to communicate despite his injuries. The scene was chaos. Blood everywhere. On the seats, the dashboard, the ground outside where it had dripped from the open doors. The officers called for ambulances, plural, then began trying to provide first aid with the limited supplies in their patrol car. They had been trained for many situations, but nothing quite prepares you for the reality of massive trauma, for the amount of blood a human body contains, for the sounds people make when they're dying. Darlene was still alive when the ambulance arrived. She was unconscious but breathing, her vital signs weak but present. The paramedics worked with desperate efficiency, starting IVs, applying pressure dressings, trying to stabilize her for transport. They loaded her into the ambulance, the driver taking the fastest route to Kaiser Foundation Hospital, hoping speed might make the difference. She died en route at 12:38 a.m. on July 5th. The official cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and exsanguination. She had bled to death despite the paramedics' best efforts. She was 22 years old. Her daughter Dina would grow up with only photographs and other people's memories of her mother. Michael was rushed into emergency surgery the moment he arrived at the hospital. The damage was extensive. His jaw was shattered, requiring reconstruction. His neck had been penetrated but miraculously missed the major blood vessels. His arm and leg had also been hit. The surgery took hours, surgeons working to repair what could be repaired, to save what could be saved. Against all odds, he survived. He would spend weeks in the hospital, months in recovery, years in physical therapy. The physical scars would fade but never disappear. The psychological scars would prove even more persistent. He had looked directly into the face of evil and survived, but survival came with its own costs. At 12:40 a.m., while doctors were still working to save Michael's life, a call came in to the Vallejo Police Department. The call was routed through an operator, who would later testify about the caller's strange demeanor. The voice was male, calm, almost matter-of-fact. He spoke with measured precision, as if reading from a prepared script. There was no emotion in the voice, no excitement, no regret, just information delivered with the flatness of a weather report. "I want to report a murder," the voice said. There was a pause, as if the caller was consulting notes. "If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." The call lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds would be analyzed for decades. The voice had a certain quality, not quite monotone, but strangely flat, as if emotion was something the speaker had heard about but never quite experienced. Some investigators thought they detected a slight accent or speech impediment. Others heard nothing but calculated coldness. The mention of those kids last year sent shockwaves through the investigation. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a serial killer announcing himself, taking credit for multiple murders, establishing his curriculum vitae of violence. The connection to David and Betty Lou's murder was immediately apparent. The same type of attack on young couples, the same lack of robbery or sexual assault, the same senseless brutality. The police dispatcher, Nancy Slover, had the presence of mind to try to keep the caller on the line, but he had already hung up. The call had come from a payphone at the intersection of Tuolumne Street and Springs Road, just a few blocks from the Vallejo Police Department itself. Officers were dispatched immediately, but the caller was long gone. The phone booth stood empty under a streetlight, its receiver hanging off the hook, still warm from the killer's hand. This was new territory for law enforcement. Killers didn't usually call to report their own crimes. They certainly didn't claim credit for previous murders. This suggested something beyond simple violence. This was communication. This was performance. Someone wanted to be known, wanted to be recognized, wanted to begin a conversation with the world. The killer wasn't content to let his crimes speak for themselves. He needed to narrate them, to ensure he received proper credit. The investigation immediately intensified. The cases were officially linked. The December attack on David and Betty Lou, the July 4th attack on Darlene and Michael. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions began working together, comparing notes, looking for patterns. They had so little to work with. Different caliber weapons were used in each attack, suggesting the killer had access to multiple guns. The victims seemed random, with no connection to each other, beyond being young couples in isolated areas. Michael Magot, once he was able to communicate, provided the first description of the killer. The man was white, probably 25 to 30 years old, with a round face and curly brown hair. He was stocky, maybe 195 to 200 pounds, about 5'8" tall. He had been wearing a blue shirt or jacket. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had before. It was a face to go with the voice, a physical presence to go with the violence. But Michael's description was problematic. He had been shot in the face, was in shock, had seen the killer primarily as a silhouette against blinding headlights. Trauma affects memory, sometimes enhancing certain details while erasing others. How reliable was his description? How much was actual memory, and how much was his brain's attempt to fill in gaps, to create a complete picture from fragments? The Bay Area woke up to a new kind of fear. This wasn't the fear of random violence. That was familiar enough in 1969, with the war in Vietnam on every television, with political assassinations and riots in the news. This was the fear of being hunted. Someone was out there, selecting victims according to criteria no one understood. Someone was watching, planning, executing a design that existed only in his mind. The newspapers ran with the story. Couple shot in Blue Rock Springs Park. Police linked 2 double shootings. Killer phones police after attack. Each headline ratcheted up the anxiety. Parents who had relaxed their vigilance after 6 months without incident suddenly reimposed strict curfews. Teenagers who had returned to lovers' lanes after the initial fear subsided now stayed away. The geography of young romance in the Bay Area was being rewritten by fear. At Terry's restaurant, Darlene's coworkers struggled to process the loss. She had been there just hours before, laughing, serving customers, full of life. Now she was gone, and the restaurant felt empty despite being full of people. They kept expecting to hear her laugh, to see her come through the door apologizing for being late, full of some story about why she had been delayed. Her daughter Dina was too young to understand that Mommy wasn't coming home. She would ask for her mother, would look toward the door when it opened, would cry at night for comfort that couldn't come. Dean Farron, Darlene's estranged husband, found himself suddenly a single parent to a toddler, trying to explain the inexplicable, trying to provide stability when his own world had been destabilized. The investigation continued around the clock. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been at Blue Rock Springs that night. They talked to Darlene's coworkers, her friends, her family. They investigated her background, looking for enemies, spurned lovers, anyone who might want her dead. They found complications. Darlene had many friends, some of them unsavory, some involved in drugs or other illegal activities, but nothing that clearly connected to the murder. There were rumors about Darlene having known her killer, having been afraid of someone in the weeks before her death. Friends reported that she had seemed nervous lately, had mentioned a man named Lee who had been bothering her. But these leads went nowhere. Memory after tragedy is unreliable, often edited to include warning signs that weren't recognized at the time or might not have existed at all. The phone call particularly troubled investigators. The killer had known details about the crime scene before police arrived. He had known about the previous murders. He had called from a location just blocks from the police station, as if taunting them with his proximity. This wasn't just someone who killed. This was someone who wanted to talk about killing, who needed the recognition, the acknowledgement that his crimes were being noticed. But the killer wasn't finished communicating. On August 1st, 1969, 3 newspapers received identical handwritten letters: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each envelope was addressed in the same strange handwriting, a mixture of cursive and print, with peculiar spelling errors that seemed almost deliberate. The return addresses were fictitious, the stamps placed at slight angles, as if the sender was being deliberately careless or was unfamiliar with normal mailing conventions. The editors at each newspaper opened their letters on the same morning, unaware that identical messages were being read across the Bay Area. The letters began the same way. Dear editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July. The handwriting was distinctive, some letters printed, others in cursive, switching seemingly at random. The spelling was inconsistent, sometimes correct, sometimes phonetic, sometimes simply wrong in ways that suggested either lack of education or deliberate obfuscation. The grammar was similarly erratic, with run-on sentences mixed with fragments, proper punctuation followed by its complete absence. Each letter contained details about the crimes that hadn't been released to the public. The killer described the ammunition used, Super X in one crime, Western in another. He described the positions of the bodies with accuracy that couldn't have come from newspaper accounts. He mentioned that the girl in the July 4th attack was wearing patterned slacks, a detail that hadn't been publicized. This was proof. This was authentication. This was real. But the letters contained something else, something that would transform the case from a series of murders into a cultural phenomenon. Each letter included a third of a cryptogram, rows of symbols and letters arranged in neat blocks, a code waiting to be broken. The killer demanded that the newspapers publish these ciphers on their front pages by August 1st, that very day. If they didn't comply, he wrote, he would go on a killing rampage. I will cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again, until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend, he wrote. The misspelling of cruise, one of many errors that investigators would analyze for clues about his education and background. The threat escalated in the letters. He would, he claimed, shoot out the tires of a school bus. He would pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. The image was horrifying. Children fleeing a disabled bus only to be gunned down one by one. It was every parent's nightmare scenario, the corruption of the most innocent space imaginable. A school bus full of children. Feel the weight of that threat. Children, a school bus, the most innocent victims imaginable, used as leverage to force newspapers to participate in the killer's game. This wasn't just violence anymore. This was psychological warfare, waged through the media, turning the entire Bay Area into unwilling participants in a deadly performance. The killer understood mass media's power to amplify fear, to spread his message beyond what any individual crime could accomplish. The newspapers faced an impossible choice: publish and give the killer the attention he craved, the platform he demanded, or refuse and risk being responsible if he followed through on his threats. They consulted with police, with lawyers, with each other. The consensus was that they had to publish. The risk of dead children was too great, the possibility of preventing tragedy by compliance too important to ignore. On August 2nd, 1969, the ciphers appeared on front pages across the Bay Area. The sight was surreal. Between advertisements for grocery stores and headlines about Vietnam, there were these rows of symbols, circles with crosses through them, triangles, letters backward and forward, Greek symbols mixed with astrological signs, mixed with letters and numbers. They looked almost like a child's game, like something you might find in a puzzle book at the drugstore. But everyone knew these symbols meant something terrible. Everyone knew they were reading a killer's thoughts, encrypted and scattered across newsprint like tea leaves waiting to be read. The public response was immediate and intense. Amateur code breakers across the Bay Area set to work. Kitchen tables became cryptography stations, covered with copies of the cipher, frequency analysis charts, trial solutions. Office workers spent their lunch breaks trying different letter substitutions, testing theories, looking for patterns. It was as if the entire region had been recruited into a massive involuntary detective agency. The killer had turned murder into a participatory event. People who had never thought about codes or ciphers found themselves obsessed. Libraries reported that books on cryptography were suddenly in demand. Teachers used the cipher as an educational tool, showing students how frequency analysis worked, how the most common letters in English could be identified even when disguised as symbols. The cipher became a cultural phenomenon, something everyone was talking about, working on, trying to solve. On August 4th, 3 days after the ciphers were published, the killer sent another letter to the San Francisco Examiner. This one began differently. Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. And with those 5 words, he named himself, the Zodiac. Like the celestial wheel that ancient astronomers used to map the heavens. Like the cosmic calendar that supposedly determined personality and fate. The name suggested both grandiosity and mysticism, both order and chaos. It referenced astrology, which was experiencing a resurgence in the late 1960s, but also suggested something older, more primal. The idea that human actions were written in the stars, that destiny was fixed and inescapable. The letter was a response to Police Chief Jack E. Stilts of Vallejo, who had requested more proof that the letters were authentic, that they weren't just someone claiming credit for crimes they hadn't committed. The Zodiac seemed almost offended by this doubt. He provided more details about the murders, details so specific that no one could question his authorship. He described what Darlene had been wearing: white blouse with a pattern, brown slacks. He described the brand of flashlight he had used to blind them, a pencil type. He described things only the killer could know. But embedded in this proof was something else, a glimpse into a mind that operated according to its own terrible logic. He wrote about collecting slaves for the afterlife. He claimed that everyone he killed would serve him in paradise. He wrote, "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner because I now have enough slaves to work for me." The misspelling of paradise would become one of his signatures, appearing in multiple letters. But beyond the spelling error was the delusion itself, the idea that murder was recruitment, that he was building a workforce for eternity. This wasn't just killing for pleasure or anger or even insanity in any conventional sense. This was killing with a cosmic purpose, at least in the killer's mind. A week later, on August 8, 1969, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Donald Hardin, a high school teacher from Salinas, and his wife Betty had been working on the cipher for days. They approached it methodically, looking for patterns, counting letter frequencies, applying the basic principles of cryptanalysis they had learned from library books. They started with the assumption that the killer would begin with I, the most common way to start a first-person statement. They looked for double letters, knowing that in English, certain combinations like LL or SS were common. They worked through the night, testing and discarding theories, building their solution letter by letter. When they finally cracked it, the message was chilling in its banality. "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives meth the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is they when I will be reborn in paradise and all that I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow it down or atop my collection of slaves for my afterlife." The message continued with more of the same, comparing killing to sex, to hunting, to collecting. It was written in a voice that was simultaneously boastful and empty, like someone performing confidence without actually feeling it. The spelling errors from the letters appeared here too. Forest instead of forest, they instead of that, paradise instead of paradise. The last 18 letters appeared to be gibberish, possibly filler to make the cipher come out even. Or possibly another code within the code that has never been solved. The decoded cipher made headlines across the country. The Zodiac had gotten what he wanted: attention, recognition, a platform for his philosophy of death. But something else had happened too. By engaging with his cipher, by solving his puzzle, the public had unwittingly entered into a relationship with him. They had accepted his invitation to play. The entire Bay Area had become participants in his game. The solution revealed a mind that was both intelligent enough to create a complex cipher and disturbed enough to fill it with juvenile fantasies. The killer could create sophisticated puzzles, but filled them with banal content about slaves in paradise. He compared killing to sex in the crude terms of a teenager, despite likely being an adult. This gap between capability and content suggested someone who was clever but not wise, someone who could perform intelligence without actually possessing depth. The summer of 1969 continued with an undercurrent of fear. Parents kept children close. Teenagers found their freedom restricted. The lovers' lanes that had been part of the social fabric of the Bay Area remained empty after dark. The Zodiac had accomplished something few criminals achieve. He had changed the behavior of an entire region through fear. But he wasn't done. He wanted more recognition, more interaction, more proof that the world was paying attention. On September 27, 1969, he would strike again, this time in broad daylight, wearing a costume that would become one of the most haunting images in criminal history. September 27, 1969. A Saturday. The first truly perfect day of autumn in Northern California. The kind of day that makes you understand why people fall in love with this part of the world. Clear sky, warm sun, cool breeze, the landscape painted in gold and green. At Lake Berryessa, a man-made reservoir in Napa County, families were making the most of what might be the last swimming weather of the year. Lake Berryessa was created in the 1950s when Monticello Dam was built, flooding Berryessa Valley. The lake stretched for miles, its irregular shoreline creating hundreds of small coves and beaches. It had become a popular recreation area, drawing visitors from throughout the Bay Area. On weekends like this one, the lake would host hundreds of people, families with picnic baskets, teenagers with radios, fishermen with their patient hope. Brian Calvin Hartnell was 20 years old, a student at Pacific Union College in Angwin, studying pre-law. He was tall, 6'4", with dark hair and the kind of serious demeanor that suggested he would make a good lawyer someday. He had grown up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which ran the college he attended. His faith was important to him, providing structure and meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic. He had driven to the lake with Cecilia Ann Shepard, 22, who was studying at the University of California, Riverside. They had dated in the past, had remained friends, and were enjoying a day away from their studies. Cecilia was pretty in an understated way, with dark blonde hair and a warm smile. She was studying to become a teacher, drawn to education by a genuine love of learning and desire to share that love with others. They had known each other for years, having met at Pacific Union College when Cecilia was a student there. Their relationship had been serious enough that they had discussed marriage, but the timing hadn't been right. Brian had law school ahead of him. Cecilia wanted to establish her teaching career. They had decided to remain friends, to see where life took them, to leave the door open for future possibilities. They found a spot on a small island connected to the shore by a narrow sand spit. The location was isolated but not remote. Other people were visible in the distance, their voices carrying across the water. They spread their blanket under a tree, unpacked their lunch, settled in for an afternoon of conversation and companionship. The sun was warm on their faces, the kind of warmth that makes you drowsy, that invites long, meandering conversations about everything and nothing. They talked about their studies, their families, their plans for the future. Brian was thinking about which law schools to apply to. Cecilia was excited about her student teaching assignment. They were young, educated, full of potential, the kind of people who seemed destined for good, productive lives. At approximately 6:30 p.m., as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, they noticed him. A man, walking toward them across the sand spit with strange purpose. He seemed to be coming directly toward them, not wandering or exploring, but moving with intention. Brian noticed him first, mentioned to Cecilia that someone was approaching. As the man got closer, they could see he was wearing something extraordinary, something that would become one of the most haunting images in criminal history. It was a black hood that covered his entire head, with clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes. On the chest was painted a white circle with a cross through it, the same symbol that had appeared in the letters, the symbol that had become the Zodiac's signature. The costume was crude but effective, clearly homemade but carefully constructed. The hood appeared to be sewn from some kind of cloth, possibly a canvas bag. The sunglasses were the cheap kind you could buy at any drugstore, clipped onto the fabric where eyes would be. The symbol on the chest was painted with what looked like White House paint, the lines slightly uneven as if drawn freehand. But it was the effect that mattered, not the craftsmanship. The figure approaching them looked like something out of a nightmare, or a medieval executioner, or a comic book villain come to life. It was simultaneously ridiculous and terrifying, a grown man playing dress-up, but playing a deadly game. Brian's first thought was that it might be a prank. Students from the college sometimes played elaborate practical jokes, but something about the man's purposeful walk, the way he held himself, suggested this wasn't a joke. Brian told Cecilia to get behind him, positioning himself between her and the approaching figure. When the man spoke, his voice was nervous, almost apologetic. It didn't match the costume, didn't match the threat he appeared to represent. He claimed to be an escaped convict from Deer Lodge, Montana. He said he had killed a prison guard, stolen a car, and needed money and their car keys to escape to Mexico. The story was elaborate, specific, but something about it rang false. Deer Lodge was a real place. It housed Montana State Prison, but the details seemed rehearsed, like something from a movie. Brian, trying to keep the situation calm, trying to prevent violence, offered everything they had. He had about $20 in his wallet. The car keys were theirs for the taking. He spoke calmly, carefully, the way you might talk to a frightened animal or an unstable person. He was trying to diffuse the situation, to give the man what he wanted so he would leave. The hooded figure seemed to relax slightly. He had Brian throw the wallet on the ground, then kicked it away without picking it up. He didn't seem interested in the money, which should have been a warning sign. What escaped convict doesn't need money? But Brian was focused on keeping Cecilia safe, on finding a peaceful resolution to an increasingly surreal situation. Then the man produced pre-cut lengths of white clothesline from somewhere under his costume. The rope was already cut to specific lengths, suggesting planning, preparation. This wasn't a spontaneous robbery. This was something that had been thought through, rehearsed, anticipated. He instructed Cecilia to tie Brian's hands behind his back. His voice was calmer now, more confident, as if producing the rope had committed him to a course of action. Cecilia took the rope with shaking hands. Brian could feel her trembling as she wrapped the rope around his wrists. She was trying to leave the knots loose, trying to give Brian a chance to escape if needed. The hooded man checked the knots, found them too loose, and retied them himself. His hands were steady now, efficient. He clearly knew how to tie knots that would hold. Then he had Brian lie face down on the blanket and tied his feet. Finally, he tied Cecilia, her hands behind her back, her feet bound. They were completely helpless now, lying face down on their picnic blanket, the beautiful day transformed into something else entirely. The man talked to them for several minutes. His voice kept changing, sometimes calm, sometimes agitated, sometimes almost conversational. He talked about his escape from prison, adding details that became increasingly implausible. He talked about needing to kill them, then about not wanting to kill them. He seemed to be having an argument with himself, working through some internal conflict that Brian and Cecilia could hear but not understand. Brian tried to keep him talking, tried to humanize himself and Cecilia, to make it harder for the man to hurt them. He talked about being a student, about Cecilia being a student, about their families who would miss them. The hooded man listened, responded occasionally, seemed almost to be enjoying the conversation. Then, without warning, without any change in his voice or demeanor, he pulled out a knife. It was long, probably 10 to 12 inches, with a wooden handle that had rivets in it. The blade caught the late afternoon sun, a flash of light that Brian saw from the corner of his eye. The man dropped to one knee beside Brian and began stabbing him in the back. The first thrust was so unexpected that Brian didn't initially understand what was happening. Then the pain hit, sharp, burning, overwhelming. 6 times the knife went in, puncturing Brian's back, one thrust collapsing his lung. Brian could taste blood in his mouth, could feel it pooling beneath him, could hear the strange sound his lung made as air escaped through the hole in his chest. When the attacker turned to Cecilia, Brian could hear but not see what happened. He heard the sound the knife made entering flesh, heard Cecilia cry out, heard her say, "I'm dying," in a voice that was small and surprised. 10 times the knife went into Cecilia. 10 deliberate, measured thrusts. The number seemed specific, as if the attacker was following some internal script, some predetermined plan. The attacker stood up when he was finished. He wasn't breathing hard, didn't seem agitated or excited. He simply walked away, leaving Brian and Cecilia tied up and bleeding on their blanket. Brian could hear his footsteps on the sand, growing fainter as he walked back across the spit toward the parking area. Brian began working on his bindings immediately, despite the pain, despite the blood loss, despite the collapsed lung that made breathing feel like drowning in air. The knots were tight but not impossible. He managed to free his hands, then untied Cecilia. She was conscious but clearly in shock, her white blouse soaked with blood, her face pale. They needed help, but they were on an island, connected to shore only by that narrow spit of sand. Brian couldn't carry Cecilia, he could barely walk himself. But they could call for help, scream, hope someone would hear. Brian began yelling, his voice weak at first but growing stronger with desperation. A fisherman named Ronald Fong heard the calls for help. He and his son had been fishing from a boat nearby and heard what sounded like someone in distress. They motored closer, saw 2 figures on the shore, one covered in blood. Fong immediately headed for the dock to get help while his son stayed near the victims, shouting encouragement across the water. Meanwhile, the Zodiac, for this was indeed him, as he would confirm in a letter, walked calmly to Brian's car, a white Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. Using a black felt-tip pen, he wrote on the passenger door, Vallejo 12-20-68, 7-4-69, Sep 27-69, 630 by knife. He was creating a scorecard, claiming credit for his crimes, signing his work like an artist signing a painting. Park rangers Kenneth Narlow and Dennis Land were first to respond. They found Brian and Cecilia both conscious, both able to talk despite their injuries. Brian described the attacker in detail, the hood, the symbol, the strange conversation about being an escaped convict. Cecilia confirmed the details, adding that she had looked into the man's eyes through the clip-on sunglasses. She said they were brown, normal-looking, calm. The victims were airlifted to Queen of the Valley Hospital in Napa. The flight medics were amazed that both victims were still conscious, still able to communicate despite their massive injuries. Brian had 6 stab wounds in his back, one of which had collapsed his lung, and another that had narrowly missed his heart by less than an inch. Cecilia had 10 wounds, several penetrating deep into her abdomen, causing massive internal bleeding. At the hospital, both were rushed into emergency surgery. Brian's collapsed lung was repaired, his wounds cleaned and sutured. The doctors were optimistic about his chances. The knife had somehow missed all his vital organs, except the lung, which was repairable. He was young, strong, and determined to survive. Cecilia's injuries were more severe. The knife had penetrated her liver, her stomach, her intestines. The internal damage was extensive, and she had lost a tremendous amount of blood. The surgeons worked for hours, repairing what they could, but they were honest with her family. Her chances were not good. For 2 days, Cecilia fought. She would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to talk to her parents, sometimes lost in delirium. She asked about Brian, was relieved to hear he would survive. She talked about the attack when she was able, providing details that might help catch her attacker. She described the hood again, the symbol, the calm brown eyes behind the sunglasses. On September 29th at 6:30 p.m., almost exactly 48 hours after the attack, Cecilia Ann Shepard died. She was 22 years old. She had wanted to be a teacher, to share her love of learning with children. Instead, she became the Zodiac's 6th confirmed victim, her story ending not in a classroom but in a hospital bed, surrounded by family who could do nothing but watch her slip away. Brian survived, though his recovery would take months. The physical wounds healed, leaving scars across his back like a map of violence. The psychological wounds were deeper, harder to heal. Survivor's guilt haunted him. Why had he lived when Cecilia died? They had received similar wounds. The knife had been the same for both of them. Was it random chance? Was there something he could have done differently? He would eventually return to school, complete his law degree, build a career and a life. But September 27th, 1969, would always be with him. The weight of the hooded figure approaching across the sand, the sound of Cecilia saying, "I'm dying," the feeling of the knife entering his back again and again. These things become part of you, woven into your DNA, carried in every cell. The investigation at Lake Berryessa revealed several important pieces of evidence. The car door with the Zodiac's writing was removed and taken into evidence. The felt-tip pen writing analyzed by handwriting experts who compared it to the letters. The rope used to tie the victims was examined for fingerprints, for fibers, for any trace evidence. Foot impressions were found and cast, suggesting the killer wore size 10.5 shoes, specifically a type called wing walkers, sold at military bases. Most importantly, a palm print was found on the car door, left when the Zodiac leaned against it while writing. It was a clear print, the kind that should have been able to identify a suspect if his prints were on file anywhere. But searches through criminal databases, military records, and government employee files found no matches. The Zodiac, whoever he was, had never been fingerprinted, or at least not in any database accessible to investigators. The hood itself became an object of intense speculation and analysis. Why wear a costume for this attack, but not the others? Was it to hide his identity from victims who might survive? Was it ritual, transformation, becoming something other than himself for the act of violence? Or was it performance, creating an image that would be remembered, described, feared? 1 week after the Lake Berryessa attack, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. The Zodiac seemed almost giddy with excitement about what he called his most recent performance. He included details about the attack that hadn't been released to the public, confirming his authorship. But he also made a strange claim that the victims had refused to be tied up, that he had been forced to stab them. This was completely false, as Brian's testimony made clear. They had cooperated fully, had done everything asked of them. This lie revealed something important about the Zodiac's psychology. He needed to see himself as justified, as responding to provocation rather than initiating violence. Even though he had planned the attack, brought pre-cut rope, worn a costume, he needed to believe the victims had somehow forced his hand. This kind of self-justification is common among violent criminals, but the Zodiac's need to revise history even in his private communications suggested a particularly fractured relationship with reality. October 11th, 1969, San Francisco. A different world from the isolated lovers' lanes and parks of the previous attacks. This was the city proper, with its steep hills and narrow streets, its Victorian houses pressed shoulder to shoulder like books on a shelf, its constant flow of people and traffic that never quite stopped, even in the deepest part of night. Paul Lee Stein was 29 years old, married, working as a cab driver to pay for his education. He had been born in Exeter, California, a small farming town in the Central Valley, but had moved to San Francisco seeking opportunity, culture, a bigger life than Exeter could offer. He was studying at San Francisco State University, taking classes during the day, driving cab at night, building toward a degree that would open doors to a better future. He had married Claudia in 1967, a small ceremony with family and close friends. They lived in a modest apartment in the Richmond district, making ends meet on his cab earnings and her salary as a secretary. They were saving money, making plans, talking about children once Paul finished school. They were at that stage of marriage where the initial romance had settled into something deeper: companionship, partnership, shared purpose. Driving a cab in San Francisco in 1969 was a decent job for someone needing flexible hours. The city never slept, always needed transportation, and tips could be good if you knew the right areas to work. Paul preferred the night shift, less traffic, better tips from people who'd been drinking, and it allowed him to attend classes during the day. He knew the city intimately. Every shortcut, every neighborhood's personality, every street's particular challenge. Just before 10 p.m. on October 11th, he picked up a fare at the intersection of Mason and Geary Streets in the heart of the theater district. It was a Saturday night, the sidewalks full of people heading to shows, to restaurants, to bars. The fare was a man, described in the dispatch log simply as male adult, destination Washington and Maple Streets in Presidio Heights. Presidio Heights was an upscale residential neighborhood, quiet and wealthy, the kind of area where cab drivers liked to get fares because the trips were usually longer, the tips usually better. The route from Union Square to Presidio Heights would take about 15 minutes, maybe 20 with traffic. It was a routine fare, the kind Paul had completed hundreds of times. The passenger was described later by witnesses as a white male, early 40s, about 5'8" to 5'9", heavy build, maybe 200 pounds. He wore dark clothing and glasses. He sat in the front seat, which wasn't unusual. Many passengers preferred the front, especially when riding alone. It felt more social, less like being chauffeured. They drove through the city, past the bright lights of downtown, into the quieter residential areas. Up Fillmore Street, with its steep grade that tested the cab's transmission. Past the shopping district at Fillmore in California, where boutiques were closed for the night, but restaurants still glowed with warm light. Into Pacific Heights, where the houses grew larger, the streets quieter, the city's energy settling into residential calm. They never made it to Washington and Maple. Instead, the cab stopped 1 block west at Washington and Cherry. It was 9:55 p.m. Three teenagers, Donald Fook, age 16, and two siblings, ages 13 and 14, were looking out from a second-story window of their house directly across the street. They had been talking, listening to records, enjoying their parents being out for the evening, when they noticed the cab stop at an unusual angle, not quite at the curb. What happened next, they witnessed in terrible detail. The passenger shot Paul Stein in the right side of his head at point-blank range. The sound of the gunshot was muffled by being inside the cab, but the teenagers recognized it for what it was. They watched as the shooter reached over Paul's body, rifling through his pockets, taking his wallet and keys. They watched as he got out of the cab, walked around to the driver's side, and did something strange. He appeared to be wiping down the cab, cleaning it with something. Then he did something that would become one of his signatures. He tore a piece from Paul Stein's shirt, using it to wipe down the cab's interior and door handles. It was methodical, careful, the actions of someone who understood evidence, who knew about fingerprints, who was thinking ahead to the investigation that would follow. When he was done, he walked away, north on Cherry Street, at a normal pace. Not running, not hurrying, just walking like anyone out for an evening stroll. The teenagers immediately called the police, giving a detailed description of the shooter. But somehow in the confusion of dispatch, in the telephone game of information being passed from witness to operator to dispatcher to patrol units, a crucial error occurred. The suspect description was changed from a white male to a black male. This error would prove catastrophic. As patrol cars converged on the scene, officers Donald Fook and Eric Zelms were driving west on Jackson Street when they passed a man walking east who perfectly matched the teenager's actual description. White male, heavy build, glasses, dark clothing. Officer Fook would later state that the man even turned and looked at their patrol car as they passed, making eye contact through the window. But they were looking for a black male. They didn't stop. They didn't question him. They didn't even slow down significantly. They continued to the scene where they discovered their error, realized they had probably passed the killer, had looked him in the eyes, and let him walk away. Fookie immediately searched the area where they had seen the man, but he was gone, vanished into the Presidio, or a waiting vehicle, or simply into the anonymous nighttime population of the city. The crime scene was chaos. Paul Stein was slumped over in his cab, blood covering the front seat, the meter still running, the radio still crackling with dispatch calls. His shirt had been torn open, a large piece missing, cut away with something sharp. The teenagers who witnessed the shooting were in shock, trying to explain what they had seen, frustrated that their description had been somehow altered in transmission. By the time the mistake was discovered and corrected, the killer had at least a 5-minute head start, possibly more. In a city like San Francisco, 5 minutes might as well be 5 hours. He could have walked into the Presidio, a vast park full of trees and shadows and countless places to hide. He could have had a car parked nearby, could already be miles away. He could have walked to a bus stop, caught public transportation, disappeared into the city's circulatory system. Police dogs were brought in, tracking the killer's scent from the cab into the Presidio, specifically to the area near the Julius Kahn playground. But the trail went cold there, suggesting he had gotten into a vehicle. The largest manhunt in San Francisco history was launched. Officers going door to door, roadblocks set up, the Presidio searched acre by acre. But it was too late. The Zodiac had killed in the heart of the city and walked away like smoke. This murder was different from the others in crucial ways. Paul Stein wasn't part of a couple. He wasn't in an isolated location. He was working, doing his job, when death found him in the form of an anonymous passenger. The Zodiac had changed his pattern, evolved his method, shown that he could strike anywhere, anytime, against anyone. The lover's lanes might be empty now, but that didn't matter. No one was safe. The entire Bay Area was his hunting ground. The witnesses provided detailed descriptions to a police sketch artist. The resulting composite showed a heavy-set white male with a crew cut, glasses, and a distinctive broad face. The sketch was distributed widely, posted in every police station, published in every newspaper. For the first time, the Zodiac had a face, even if it wasn't his real face, even if it was just an artist's interpretation of teenagers' traumatized memories. 3 days later, on October 14th, the Chronicle received another letter. The Zodiac was furious about the police response, particularly about the officers who had passed him. "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Street plus Maple last night. To prove this, here is a blood-stained piece of his shirt. I am the same man who did in the people in the North Bay area." Enclosed was indeed a piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt, torn from the tail. The blood was analyzed, confirmed to be Paul's type. This was proof, authentication that the letter writer was the killer. The Zodiac continued, "The SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly, instead of holding road races with their motorcycles, seeing who could make the most noise. The car drivers should have just parked their cars and sat there quietly waiting for me to come out of cover." His anger was palpable even through the strange spelling and grammar. He had been seen, almost caught, and escaped through luck and police error. But rather than being relieved, he seemed insulted that the police hadn't been more competent. It was as if he wanted to be caught by worthy opponents, not escape through bureaucratic incompetence. He ended this letter with a new threat, one that would terrorize parents throughout the Bay Area. "School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire, plus then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." The image was horrifying in its specificity, not just threatening children, but describing exactly how he would do it. Shoot out the tire to disable the bus. Wait for the children to evacuate. Pick them off one by one as they fled what should be a place of safety. It was every parent's worst nightmare, made worse by the Zodiac's proven willingness to follow through on his threats. School districts across the Bay Area went into crisis mode. Buses were rerouted to avoid isolated areas where a shooter might hide. Some districts hired armed guards to ride on buses. Others implemented convoy systems, with multiple buses traveling together for safety. Parents who could afford it drove their children to school rather than trust the buses. Attendance dropped as some parents simply kept their children home. The psychological impact on children was profound. They practiced new kinds of drills, not just earthquake drills or fire drills, but bad man drills, where they would practice staying low, moving quickly, finding cover. 7-year-olds were being taught to zigzag when running to make themselves harder targets. The innocence of childhood was being systematically destroyed by one man's threats. But let's pause here and consider the families left behind. Paul Stine's widow, Claudia, suddenly alone in their Richmond district apartment, his textbook still on the desk, his side of the bed still indented from his last sleep. She would have to identify his body, make funeral arrangements, figure out how to live without the future they had planned together. The children they had talked about would never be born. The degree he was working toward would never be completed. Think about Paul's parents in Exeter, getting the call that every parent dreads. Their son had moved to the big city to make something of himself, and now he was gone, killed for no reason by a stranger who would use his blood as a calling card. They would have to drive to San Francisco, see their son's body, try to understand how this could happen to their boy, who had always been so careful, so responsible, so full of promise. Think about the 3 teenagers who witnessed the murder. They had seen death happen in real time, had watched a man's life end through their bedroom window. They would replay that scene in their minds for years, decades, the rest of their lives. They would wonder if they could have done something different, warned Paul somehow, even though logic said there was nothing they could have done. They would carry the weight of being witnesses to evil, of having seen the Zodiac's face and living with the knowledge that their mistranscribed description let him escape. These are the real costs of violence, not just the lives ended, but the lives forever changed. The ripples spreading outward from each attack, touching friends, family, colleagues, entire communities. The Zodiac counted victims, but he never counted the survivors, the grievers, the witnesses, the ones left behind to carry the weight of absence and memory. November 1969 brought more letters, more threats, more evidence that the Zodiac was escalating not in violence but in communication. He seemed to be writing constantly now, maintaining his side of a conversation with a public that had no choice but to listen. On November 8th, he sent a greeting card to the Chronicle with another piece of Paul Stein's shirt. The card had text printed on it. "Sorry I haven't written, but I just washed my pen." Inside, he had written, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I thought you would need a good laugh before you hear the bad news. You won't get the news for a while yet. P.S. Could you print this new cipher on the front page? I get awfully lonely when I am ignored, so lonely I could do my thing." The casual tone was chilling. He was treating serial murder like a social correspondence, apologizing for not writing sooner as if he were a friend who had been out of touch. The threat was clear. Ignore him and he would kill again. He was holding the entire Bay Area hostage to his need for attention. Included was another cipher, 340 symbols arranged in a block. This one would prove much more difficult than the first, resisting all attempts at solution for over 50 years. The best cryptographers in the country tried to crack it. The FBI's code-breaking unit analyzed it. Amateur investigators spent thousands of hours on it. But it remained unsolved, its message locked away, taunting investigators with the possibility that it might contain the Zodiac's name, his location, something that would finally identify him. On November 9th, he sent another letter, this time claiming 7 victims instead of the 5 that were confirmed. Investigators wondered who the other 2 might be. Were there victims they didn't know about? Was he claiming unrelated murders? Or was he simply inflating his numbers for effect? The uncertainty was maddening, forcing investigators to review every unsolved murder in Northern California, looking for connections that might or might not exist. He also sent a diagram of what he called his death machine, a device he claimed to have built for killing school children. The diagram showed a complex system of lights and mirrors that would supposedly allow him to see and shoot in darkness without being detected. Engineers who analyzed the diagram said it was theoretically possible but practically useless, more fantasy than functional weapon. But the fact that he was thinking about it, planning it, designing devices specifically for killing children was terrifying regardless of practicality. December 1969 brought the holiday season, and with it, new threats from the Zodiac. In a letter received on December 20th, exactly 1 year after David and Betty Lou's murder, he threatened to kill anyone who was alone on Christmas and New Year's Eve. The entire Bay Area shifted its holiday plans around this threat. No one wanted to be alone. Parties that might have been small became large gatherings. People who might have spent a quiet evening at home sought company, any company, rather than risk being alone when the Zodiac came calling. The letter also included a claim that he had killed a man named Richard Raditich, a San Francisco police officer shot while sitting in his patrol car in June. But the ballistics didn't match. The MO was different, and investigators concluded the Zodiac was probably lying, claiming any convenient murder to inflate his reputation. This pattern of claiming unverified victims would continue, making it impossible to know his true body count. Christmas Eve came and went without incident. No attacks, no murders. New Year's Eve passed similarly quietly. The Zodiac had discovered he could terrorize without actually killing, that the threat of violence could be as powerful as violence itself. He had turned fear into his instrument, playing it across the Bay Area like some terrible symphony only he could conduct. 1970 arrived with more letters, more ciphers, more demands for attention. The Zodiac began demanding that people wear buttons with his symbol, the cross circle, to show they were afraid of him. He wanted visible proof of his impact, wanted to see his mark on the bodies of the living as well as the dead. "I want to see people wearing my button. On the front, it would have the Zodiac crosshair symbol. On the back, it would say Zodiac Lives. If I see people wearing them, I won't kill." Some people actually made and wore these buttons, reasoning that compliance might offer protection. Others made parody versions. Zodiac sucks, or Zodiac is a coward. The sight of any version of these buttons on the streets of San Francisco was surreal. ordinary citizens wearing references to a serial killer, turning themselves into walking reminders of ongoing terror. But something was changing. The letters were becoming more erratic, more desperate. The Zodiac seemed frustrated that his ciphers weren't being solved, angry that newspapers weren't giving him front-page coverage for every communication. He was like a performer playing to a crowd that was slowly losing interest, not because the act wasn't terrifying, but because terror, sustained too long, becomes exhausting. In March 1970, he sent a letter that revealed this frustration explicitly. "If you don't print this cipher, I will do something nasty which you know I am capable of doing. By the way, have you cracked the last cipher I sent you? My name is," followed by 13 symbols that have never been decoded. He was taunting investigators with the possibility that he had revealed his name, knowing they couldn't read it. It was cruel in its simplicity. Here is the answer you seek, but you're too stupid to understand it. The 13 symbols have been analyzed countless times, tested against every cryptographic technique known, but remain unsolved. On April 20th, 1970, the Zodiac sent a letter claiming responsibility for a bomb he said he had planted on a school bus. No bomb was found, but the threat alone was enough to disrupt the entire school system. Every bus had to be searched. Parents kept children home. The psychological warfare continued even as actual violence seemed to have stopped. The letter also contained one of his most chilling lines. "I am not sick. I am insane. But that will not stop the game." This distinction between sickness and insanity suggested a level of self-awareness that made him more frightening. He knew he was insane. He embraced it. He used it as justification for continuing his game. In July 1970, 2 letters arrived that would become among the most analyzed in the case. The first claimed credit for the near abduction of Kathleen Johns and her infant daughter. Johns had been driving on Highway 132 near Modesto on March 22nd when a man in another car indicated something was wrong with her wheel. When she pulled over, he offered to help but actually loosened her wheel further, causing it to fall off entirely when she tried to drive away. The man then offered her a ride, which she accepted out of desperation. She was alone with an infant on a dark highway. For the next 2 hours, he drove her around isolated roads, making threats, telling her he was going to kill her and her baby. She finally escaped when he stopped the car, running into a field with her daughter and hiding until he gave up looking for them. When shown the composite sketch of the Zodiac from the Paul Stein murder, Johns identified him as her abductor. The Zodiac's letter seemed to confirm this, providing details about the incident. But investigators were divided. Was this really the Zodiac, or was he claiming credit for someone else's crime? The MO was different, the location outside his usual territory. But the psychological torture, the cat-and-mouse game, felt consistent with his personality. The second July letter was even stranger. Written on a piece of stationery from a hotel in Riverside, it contained a bizarre fantasy about torturing slaves in his afterlife paradise. "I shall listen to their pleas for water, and I shall laugh at them. I shall not give them food, and I shall laugh as they beg and sob. I will rip out their stomachs and use their insides for rope to tie them to trees." The graphic nature of these fantasies suggested an escalation in his internal violence, even as his actual attacks seemed to have stopped. Was he satisfying his violent urges through writing rather than action? Or was he building towards something worse? October 1970 brought a postcard with another threat against school children, this time claiming he had already killed some. "I am crack-proof. Tell the herb scene that I am still here. I have been rather busy lately, collecting slaves for the afterlife. About 2 weeks ago I shot a kid in a yellow school bus." No such shooting had occurred, but the claim had to be investigated. Every injury to a child, every accident involving a school bus, had to be examined for possible connection to the Zodiac. The resources consumed by these false claims were enormous, pulling investigators away from actual evidence to chase phantoms. The reference to Herb Sane was significant. Sane was the most famous columnist in San Francisco, his daily column in the Chronicle read by everyone who mattered in the city. The Zodiac wanted Kane's attention specifically, wanted to be mentioned in the column that shaped public opinion. It was another sign of his desperate need for recognition, for validation from the cultural arbiters of the Bay Area. 1971 saw the frequency of letters decrease, but the grandiosity of claims increase. The Zodiac now claimed 13 victims, then 17, then 37. The numbers seemed arbitrary, possibly fictional. He was becoming a parody of himself, a killer so desperate for attention that he was willing to claim any death as his own. In March 1971, he sent a letter that seemed almost plaintive. I am crack-proof. What is the price tag for this carnival ride? 17 plus, and I will go on and on until I have killed 40 or more. Yes, I am still here. Contrary to the lies told in the newspapers, when will you people believe me? The misspelling of believe at the end seemed almost poignant. A serial killer upset that people didn't believe his inflated victim count. He had become dependent on public attention, on being taken seriously, and the gradual skepticism about his claims was clearly bothering him. Some investigators began to wonder if the later letters were even from the original Zodiac. The handwriting was similar, but not identical. The tone had shifted from confident to desperate. The claims had become so outlandish that even the public was beginning to doubt. Was this still the same person who had killed with such cold efficiency in 1968 and 1969? Or was this a copycat, someone who had studied the original letters and was now continuing the correspondence? The last confirmed Zodiac letter arrived at the Chronicle on January 29, 1974. It was brief, almost perfunctory. I am back with you. Tell Herb Scene I am here. I have always been here. That city pig cop is good, but I am smarter and better. He will get tired, then leave me alone. I am waiting for a good movie about me. Who will play me? I am now in control of all things. The reference to wanting a movie about himself revealed the depth of his narcissism. He saw himself as a character worthy of Hollywood treatment, a villain important enough to be immortalized on film. The claim to be in control of all things suggested either deepening delusion or desperate bravado. After this letter, silence. No more correspondence, no more ciphers, no more threats. The Zodiac simply stopped writing, disappearing into the same void from which he had emerged. The investigations continued. They continue to this day, but the voice that had terrorized the Bay Area for 5 years went quiet. Think about that silence. After so many words, so many symbols, so many threats, there was nothing, just absence. The public was left waiting for a conclusion that never came, for one more letter, one more cipher, one more chance to understand who had been speaking to them from the darkness. The sudden cessation of letters created its own form of anxiety. Had the Zodiac died? Been arrested for another crime? Moved away? Or was he still out there, watching, waiting, choosing silence as his new form of torture? Every few months, someone would report seeing someone who looked like the composite sketch. Every unsolved murder in Northern California was examined for possible Zodiac connections. The absence of communication became as oppressive as the letters had been. Over the decades that followed, hundreds of suspects would be proposed, investigated, dismissed, or retained as possibilities. Each had their advocates, investigators, or amateur detectives convinced they had found the solution. The case became a Rorschach test where everyone saw what they wanted to see, found patterns that confirmed their theories while dismissing evidence that didn't fit. Arthur Leigh Allen became the most famous suspect, the subject of books and films. He was a Vallejo elementary school teacher who had been fired for molesting students. He owned a Zodiac watch, the same brand that gave the killer his name. He had been reported to police by a friend, Don Chaney, who claimed Allen had spoken about hunting humans, about calling himself Zodiac, about attacking couples in lovers' lanes. The circumstantial evidence against Allen was compelling. He lived in Vallejo, knew the areas where attacks occurred. He was interviewed by police multiple times, his home searched. He had bloody knives in his car, which he claimed were from killing chickens. He wore size 10.5 Wingwalker boots, the same type and size as prints found at Lake Berryessa. He had been at Lake Berryessa on the day of the attack, he admitted, but claimed to have been alone, scuba diving. But the physical evidence didn't match. His fingerprints didn't match the bloody print on Paul Stein's cab. His handwriting didn't match the letters, though he was ambidextrous and could have disguised it. His DNA, tested years later from the letter stamps, didn't match either, though there was no certainty the DNA on the stamps was actually from the Zodiac. Allen died in 1992, taking any secrets to his grave. His death prompted a new wave of interest in the case, with some investigators convinced they had let the real Zodiac die without justice. Others pointed out that despite intensive investigation, no physical evidence definitively linked Allen to any crime. He remained what he had been in life, a deeply suspicious character who might have been a serial killer, or might have been a disturbed man who enjoyed the attention of being a suspect. Richard Gaikowski was another prominent suspect, a journalist and filmmaker who some thought matched the voice on the Zodiac's recorded call to police. He had worked at the Good Times newspaper in San Francisco, had written about counterculture and radical politics. His appearance somewhat matched the composite sketch, and he had connections to the areas where murders occurred. The theory about Gaikowski was elaborate, involving claims that the Zodiac ciphers contained his name, that certain phrases in the letters were references to his work or life. But again, no physical evidence linked him to the crimes. He had died in 2004, another suspect taking potential answers to the grave. Ross Sullivan was a library assistant at Riverside City College who bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketches. He had suffered from bipolar disorder, had been hospitalized for mental health issues. He was at the library when Cherry Jo Bates was murdered nearby in 1966, a crime some investigators believed was an early Zodiac killing, though this connection was disputed. Sullivan had disappeared after the Bates murder, reappearing later in different locations. His whereabouts during the confirmed Zodiac attacks were unknown. He died in 1977, young and troubled, another person whose death ended investigation rather than providing closure. Lawrence Kane was a businessman who had been arrested for prowling and voyeurism. His name could be found in some of the ciphers if you looked for it in certain ways. He had lived in the areas where attacks occurred, had a history of violence against women. One victim's sister claimed to recognize him from photographs. But again, the physical evidence didn't match, and Kane died in 2010 without ever being definitively linked to the crimes. Each suspect had passionate advocates among investigators and amateur detectives. Online forums were filled with thousands of pages of discussion about minute details, comparing handwriting samples, analyzing speech patterns, creating timelines that might place suspects at crime scenes. The Zodiac case had become a massive collaborative investigation, with participants around the world contributing theories, discoveries, and endless debate. The cipher community continued working on the unsolved messages. The 340-character cipher sent in 1969 resisted all attempts at solution for 51 years. Every cryptographic technique was applied: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, computer modeling. The cipher seemed designed to be unsolvable, or perhaps it was nonsense disguised as meaning, the ultimate joke on those trying to decode it. In December 2020, a breakthrough finally came. 3 amateur codebreakers, David Orenchak, Jarl Van Eyck, and Sam Blake, working together across continents, finally cracked the 340 cipher. The solution required recognizing that the Zodiac had used multiple encryption techniques, including diagonal shifts and symbol substitutions that had made traditional decryption methods useless. The decoded message read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me, where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death." Even decoded, the message revealed nothing useful about the Zodiac's identity. No name, no location, no clue that investigators could use. Just more of the same grandiose delusion about slaves and paradise, the same boastful tone, the same misspellings. 51 years of effort to discover the Zodiac had essentially said nothing of value. It was the ultimate anticlimax, proof that the ciphers had always been more about creating mystery than revealing truth. The reference to the TV show was intriguing. On October 22, 1969, someone claiming to be the Zodiac had called into Jim Dunbar's morning talk show on KGO-TV. The caller had spoken with attorney Melvin Belly for nearly 2 hours, with portions broadcast live. The caller had sounded different from the confirmed Zodiac recording. Younger, more emotional. Most investigators believed it had been a hoax, and the decoded cipher seemed to confirm this. The ongoing investigation revealed how much the Zodiac case had shaped criminal investigation techniques. The coordination between multiple jurisdictions, initially chaotic and problematic, had led to better protocols for handling multi-jurisdictional cases. The use of behavioral profiling, primitive in 1969, had become a sophisticated tool partly because of lessons learned from the Zodiac investigation. The case had also revealed the limitations of investigation. Despite thousands of hours of professional investigation, despite millions of dollars in resources, despite the attention of the entire nation, the Zodiac remained unidentified. He had proven that with careful planning and luck, someone could commit multiple murders and never be caught, could terrorize an entire region and disappear without consequence. This failure of justice had profound effects on the families of victims. Betty Lou Jensen's siblings grew into middle age, then old age, never knowing who had killed their sister or why. They attended periodic case updates from law enforcement, hoping each time that this would be the breakthrough. They watched as suspects were identified and eliminated, as promising leads went nowhere, as the case became colder with each passing year. David Faraday's family experienced similar frustration. His mother had kept his room exactly as it was for years after his death, unable to let go, unable to move forward without answers. She died in 1980, never knowing who had killed her son. His father followed a few years later, both parents going to their graves without the closure that justice might have provided. Darlene Ferrin's daughter Dina grew up without her mother, raised by various family members, always aware of the shadow cast by her mother's murder. She would occasionally be contacted by investigators or journalists wanting to know about her mother, asking her to relive a trauma she couldn't even remember, but which had shaped her entire life. Paul Stein's widow, Claudia, eventually remarried, built a new life, but never forgot her first husband or forgave his killer. She avoided all media coverage of the case, finding it too painful to see her husband's death turned into entertainment, his blood-stained shirt becoming a prop in the Zodiac's performance. Brian Hartnell, the survivor of Lake Berryessa, became a successful lawyer as he had planned, but he carried the scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke publicly about the attack, preferring to keep that part of his life private. When he did speak, it was with remarkable composure, describing the attack factually, without drama, as if discussing something that had happened to someone else. Michael Mageau, who survived Blue Rock Springs, had a harder time. His injuries had been severe, his recovery long and painful. He struggled with PTSD before that diagnosis was widely recognized or treated. He moved frequently, had difficulty maintaining relationships or employment, his life derailed by a few minutes of violence on a July night. The cultural impact of the Zodiac extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case had changed how the Bay Area thought about safety, about public spaces, about strangers. Parents who had grown up in the shadow of the Zodiac raised their children with heightened vigilance, passing down fears that originated before they were born. The case influenced popular culture profoundly. Films like Dirty Harry and Zodiac brought fictionalized or dramatized versions of the story to international audiences. The Zodiac became a character in novels, television shows, video games. Each interpretation added layers to the myth, sometimes obscuring the real human tragedy beneath the cultural phenomenon. This transformation from tragedy to entertainment raised ethical questions. Was it appropriate to make entertainment from real murders? How did the families feel seeing their loved ones' deaths recreated for profit? The Zodiac had wanted fame and society had given it to him, but at what cost to our collective humanity? The internet age brought new dimensions to the case. Websites devoted to the Zodiac proliferated, each offering theories, evidence, discussion forums. Thousands of people worldwide became amateur investigators, poring over case files that had been digitized and made public. The democratization of investigation meant more eyes on the evidence, but also more noise, more false leads, more conspiracy theories. Social media added another layer. Every few months, someone would claim to have solved the case, their announcement going viral before being debunked. People claimed their fathers, grandfathers, neighbors were the Zodiac based on circumstantial evidence or family resemblance to sketches. The line between legitimate investigation and internet speculation became increasingly blurred. In 2018, investigators announced they were using genealogical DNA techniques to try to identify the Zodiac. These techniques had successfully solved other cold cases, including identifying the Golden State Killer. Hope renewed that technology might finally provide answers, but the DNA from the Zodiac letters was partial, degraded, contaminated from years of handling. Results were inconclusive, another disappointment in a case full of them. The physics of time worked against the investigation. Witnesses died, memories faded, evidence degraded. If the Zodiac had been in his 20s or 30s during the crimes, he would be in his 70s or 80s now if still alive. More likely, he was already dead, taking his secrets to an unmarked grave, achieving the anonymity in death that he had avoided in life. Some investigators believed the Zodiac had died shortly after his last letter in 1974. They pointed to the sudden cessation of communication from someone who seemed addicted to attention. Perhaps illness, accident, or suicide had ended his life. The idea that he had died unidentified, never facing justice, was painful but increasingly probable. Others believed he had simply stopped, satisfied with what he had achieved, smart enough to quit while ahead. This theory imagined him living a normal life after 1974, perhaps with family who never suspected, dying peacefully of old age, while his crimes remained unsolved. The banality of this possibility was almost more disturbing than continued violence would have been. The case files grew to fill entire rooms. Thousands of pages of interviews, hundreds of pieces of physical evidence, countless photographs and diagrams. Each new investigator who took on the case had to master this mountain of information, looking for patterns others might have missed, connections that might finally make sense of the senseless. The psychological profile of the Zodiac evolved over the years as understanding of serial killers deepened. Initially, he was thought to be a sexual sadist, but the lack of sexual assault suggested other motivations. The slave fantasy suggested a power control killer, someone who killed for the feeling of dominance. The letters and ciphers suggested a narcissist who craved attention and recognition. But profiles are generalizations, and the Zodiac resisted easy categorization. He killed couples but also a lone man. He used guns and knives. He attacked in isolated areas and in the city. He sometimes wore a costume, sometimes didn't. He was both careful and reckless, intelligent and crude, controlled and impulsive. Every rule seemed to have an exception. The geographic profile of his crimes suggested someone familiar with the Bay Area, possibly someone who had lived there all his life. The attack sites were connected by specific roads, suggesting someone who knew the area's geography intimately. But the Bay Area had millions of residents. Geographic familiarity narrowed the suspect pool, but not enough to identify an individual. The linguistic analysis of his letters revealed someone with above-average intelligence, but possibly deliberately dumbing down his writing. The misspellings seemed sometimes genuine, sometimes forced. The grammar errors followed no consistent pattern. It was as if multiple people were writing the letters, or one person was deliberately creating inconsistency to confuse investigators. Modern psychological understanding suggested the Zodiac might have had a personality disorder, antisocial, narcissistic, possibly borderline. The grandiose fantasies, the need for attention, the lack of empathy, all pointed to severe psychological disturbance. But millions of people have personality disorders without becoming serial killers. Mental illness alone couldn't explain the Zodiac. The question of why he stopped remains central to understanding the case. Serial killers rarely stop voluntarily. They usually continue until caught or dead. The Zodiac's cessation suggested something had changed. Had he been imprisoned for another crime? Had he moved to another area and continued killing without taking credit? Had he achieved some psychological satisfaction that removed the need to kill? Some investigators looked at unsolved murders in other states after 1974, searching for similar patterns. There were always cases that seemed possibly connected. Couples killed, taunting letters to police, similar victimology. But nothing definitive, nothing that clearly said the Zodiac had simply changed his location. The international interest in the case led to theories that the Zodiac had been inspired by other killers or had inspired killers elsewhere. The monster of Florence in Italy showed similarities. Couples attacked, taunting letters to police. The Texarkana moonlight murders in the 1940s had similar elements. Were these connected, or was there something about this type of crime that occurred independently in different times and places? The Zodiac had wanted to be remembered, and in this he succeeded beyond what he probably imagined. Academic papers were written about the case. It was taught in criminology classes. It became a standard reference in discussions of serial murder, criminal communication, public terror. He had written himself into history with blood and ciphers. But what kind of immortality had he achieved? He was remembered not as a person, but as a question mark. His name, his real name, remained unknown. His face remained a composite sketch that might or might not resemble reality. He existed as an absence, a void in the shape of a person. Is that really immortality, or is it a kind of erasure? The victims, by contrast, were remembered as people. Their names were known. Their faces were real. Their stories, though cut short, were complete in ways the Zodiacs never would be. They had been loved, were still loved, would always be loved. The Zodiac had been feared, was still feared, but fear isn't the same as remembrance. As we approach the present day, the Zodiac case remains Northern California's most infamous unsolved mystery. New investigators still take on the case, bringing fresh eyes and new technologies. DNA testing continues to improve. Database searches become more sophisticated. Hope persists that someday, somehow, the case will be solved. In 2020, a team calling itself the Case Breakers claimed to have identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Poste, an Air Force veteran who had died in 2018. They based their conclusion on physical resemblance to sketches, behavioral similarities, and what they claimed were his name hidden in ciphers. But law enforcement agencies didn't confirm their conclusions, and the evidence remains circumstantial. Every few years, another such announcement appears. Someone's father confessed on his deathbed. Someone found evidence in an attic. Someone decoded a hidden message in the letters. Most are quickly debunked or fade away for lack of evidence. The Zodiac case has become like the Kennedy assassination, a mystery that generates endless theories, but no definitive answers. The physical evidence still exists, carefully preserved in evidence lockers. The letters in their protective sleeves, the bloody shirt pieces, the shell casings, the rope from Lake Berryessa. These objects have outlasted many of the investigators who collected them. They wait with infinite patience for technology that might finally unlock their secrets. Future technologies we can't yet imagine might provide answers. Just as DNA analysis didn't exist in 1969, there may be techniques developing now in laboratories that will seem obvious in retrospect. Quantum computing might break the remaining ciphers. New forms of genetic analysis might work with degraded samples. Artificial intelligence might find patterns humans have missed. Or perhaps the case will never be solved. Perhaps the Zodiac will remain forever unknown, a shadow that terrorized Northern California and then vanished. Perhaps that's its own form of justice, denying him the recognition he craved, leaving him as nobody, nothing, just a question mark in the darkness. The impact on law enforcement was lasting. The Zodiac case became a textbook study in what to do and what not to do in serial killer investigations. The initial jurisdictional conflicts taught the importance of cooperation. The cipher publication debate established protocols for dealing with killer communications. The public panic showed the need for careful information management. Modern serial killer investigations owe much to lessons learned from the Zodiac case. The importance of preserving evidence for future technology, the need for centralized databases, the value of behavioral profiling, the danger of public hysteria. These lessons were written in blood, but have possibly prevented other tragedies. The case also revealed the limits of law enforcement. Despite enormous resources, dedicated investigators, and public cooperation, the Zodiac escaped justice. This failure haunted many investigators for the rest of their careers. Dave Toshke, the San Francisco detective who became the face of the investigation, never stopped believing the case could be solved. He died in 2018, going to his grave without answers. Think about the weight of that. Dedicating your professional life to solving a puzzle that refuses solution, to catching a killer who may already be dead, to providing justice that remains perpetually out of reach. The Zodiac created many kinds of victims, not all of them recorded in official casualty lists. The investigators who spent decades chasing shadows were casualties too, in their way. The amateur investigators deserve recognition too. Thousands of people have devoted countless hours to this case, not for pay or glory, but from a genuine desire to see justice done. They've created websites, written books, produced documentaries. They've kept the case alive in public consciousness when official investigation had largely stopped. Some of these amateur investigators have made genuine contributions. The cipher solutions came from amateurs. Many of the most interesting suspect identifications came from private citizens. The digitization of case files that made evidence widely available was largely done by volunteers. The Zodiac case became perhaps the world's largest crowd-sourced criminal investigation. But this amateur investigation has also had negative effects. False accusations have ruined lives. Innocent people have been harassed because they resembled sketches or had circumstantial connections to the case. The line between investigation and obsession has been crossed repeatedly. Some people have lost relationships, careers, mental health to their fixation on solving the case. The Zodiac has inspired copycat crimes over the decades. People have sent fake Zodiac letters to newspapers. Some have committed murders and tried to make them look like Zodiac crimes. The symbol, the crossed circle, has been spray painted at crime scenes by people seeking to borrow his infamy. Each copycat crime requires investigation, resources, attention that could be spent on actual cases. The commercialization of the case continues. Tours visit the crime scenes. Books are published every year with new theories. Television shows revisit the evidence. The Zodiac has become a brand, a property, a commodity. Murder has been transformed into content, tragedy into entertainment. The victims' families watch their loved ones' deaths become fodder for true crime podcasts, their grief monetized by others. Yet there's something valuable in the continued attention. Every generation that discovers the Zodiac case brings fresh perspectives. Young investigators apply new techniques. International attention means experts worldwide contribute insights. The case refuses to be forgotten, and in that refusal is hope that someday, somehow, answers will come. The psychological impact on the Bay Area has faded, but never fully disappeared. Parents still tell children about the Zodiac when explaining why they can't go certain places alone. Lake Herman Road is still known as where it started. Blue Rock Springs is still where Darlene died. Lake Berryessa still carries the memory of the hooded figure. These places have been marked by violence in ways that time doesn't fully erase. The generation that lived through the Zodiac terror is aging, dying, taking their memories with them. Soon no one will remain who remembers the fear firsthand, who recalls checking their cars before getting in, who remembers when the letters dominated headlines. The Zodiac will pass from memory into history, from lived experience into archived story. But the questions will remain. Who was he? Why did he kill? What did the unsolved ciphers say? Where did he go? These questions have become almost mythological, like wondering about Jack the Ripper's identity or Amelia Earhart's fate. They're questions that may never have answers, but will never stop being asked. The Zodiac wanted to create slaves for his afterlife, but he created something else instead. An endless investigation, a perpetual mystery, a story without an ending. Thousands of people remain enslaved to the puzzle he created, working to solve ciphers, identify suspects, provide answers. In a perverse way, he did create slaves, just not in the way he imagined. As we near the end of this long journey through darkness, it's important to remember what matters most. Not the killer, whose name we don't know. Not the mystery, which may never be solved. But the victims, whose names we do know, whose lives mattered, whose deaths diminished us all. David Arthur Faraday, 17, who loved mathematics and earned his Eagle Scout badge. Betty Lou Jensen, 16, who collected stuffed animals and wanted a love story like Elizabeth Bennet's. Darlene Elizabeth Farron, 22, who had a laugh that could fill a room and a daughter who would grow up without her. Cecilia Ann Shepard, 22, who wanted to be a teacher and share her love of learning. Paul Lee Stein, 29, who drove a cab at night to pay for his education and build a better future. These were real people with real lives, real hopes, real dreams. They weren't characters in the Zodiac story. They had their own stories, interrupted by violence, ended too soon. They deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as people, complete and complex, loved and loving. The survivors deserve recognition too. Michael Maggio, who survived Blue Rock Springs despite being shot multiple times. Brian Hartnell, who survived Lake Berryessa and built a successful life despite his trauma. Kathleen Johns, who escaped with her infant daughter. The 3 teenagers who witnessed Paul Stein's murder and tried to help. These people faced evil and survived, carrying their experiences forward, refusing to be defined only by what happened to them. The families of victims have shown remarkable strength. They've endured decades of uncertainty, of false hopes, of their loved ones' deaths being turned into entertainment. They've maintained dignity in the face of an undignified situation. They've kept the memories of their loved ones alive, while the memory of their killer remains shrouded in mystery. The investigators, professional and amateur, who have devoted years to this case, deserve acknowledgement. They've refused to let the case die, refused to accept that evil gets the final word. Their persistence in the face of repeated failure is its own form of heroism. They may never solve the case, but their refusal to stop trying matters. The communities affected have shown resilience. Vallejo, Benicia, San Francisco, Napa, these places absorbed terrible trauma and continued. They integrated their dark history without being consumed by it. They proved that places, like people, can be more than the worst thing that happened there. As this story comes to its close, we're left with more questions than answers. The Zodiac remains unknown, his motives unclear, his fate uncertain. The case remains open, officially unsolved, likely to remain so. Justice, in any traditional sense, seems impossible now. Too much time has passed, too many witnesses have died, too much evidence has degraded. But perhaps there are other forms of justice. The Zodiac wanted to be famous, and he is, but as a cautionary tale rather than a figure of power. He wanted to be feared, but now he's more studied than feared. His letters analyzed by students who weren't born when he killed. He wanted slaves for his afterlife, but the only afterlife he achieved is as an unsolved question, a nobody with delusions of grandeur. The real immortality belongs to his victims. They are remembered with love rather than fear. Their lives, however brief, had meaning beyond being ended. They were sons and daughters, friends and lovers, students and workers. They were part of families, communities, the human fabric that violence tears but cannot destroy. The Zodiac tore holes in that fabric, but the fabric endured. Life continued. People fell in love, had children, built futures. The lovers' lanes eventually filled again with young couples. The parks reopened to families. The city streets carried their endless flow of life. The Zodiac could kill individuals, but he couldn't kill life itself. Time has a way of diminishing evil while preserving good. The Zodiac's threats now seem dated, his ciphers quaint, his letters the ravings of someone desperate for attention. But the love felt for his victims remains fresh, renewed with each telling of their stories. They are mourned by people who never met them, remembered by a society that refuses to forget them. The investigation continues, officially. There are still detectives assigned to the case, still tips coming in, still evidence being tested. But the real investigation now is not about identifying the Zodiac. It's about understanding what his case tells us about violence, fear, community, resilience. It's about learning from the darkness to better appreciate the light. Every unsolved case is a wound that doesn't heal. The Zodiac case is a particularly deep wound, not just because of the lives lost, but because of the way they were lost, randomly, senselessly, with the killer announcing himself and still escaping justice. It challenges our belief in order, in consequence, in the idea that evil is ultimately punished. But wounds, even ones that don't heal, can teach us. The Zodiac case taught us about the nature of evil, that it can be banal and grandiose simultaneously, that it can speak clearly and still remain mysterious, that it can demand attention and achieve only emptiness. It taught us about fear, how it spreads, how it changes behavior, how it can be weaponized. It taught us about resilience, how communities respond to threat, how families endure loss, how life insists on continuing. Most importantly, it taught us about the importance of remembering victims as people rather than statistics. David, Betty Lou, Darlene, Cecilia, and Paul were not points on the Zodiac scorecard. They were complete human beings whose lives mattered infinitely more than the mystery of who ended them. The night has grown deep as this story reaches its conclusion. Somewhere, the places where these crimes occurred sit in darkness, unchanged and yet forever changed. The roads still curve through the same hills. The parks still offer the same views. The city streets still carry their traffic. But they carry memory too, invisible but indelible, part of the story of these places. Somewhere, perhaps, are answers to the questions we've been asking for over 50 years. In an attic, a safety deposit box, a forgotten evidence locker, in the memory of someone who saw something but didn't realize its significance, in DNA degraded but not destroyed, in a cipher solution not yet discovered, or perhaps the answers died with the Zodiac, whenever and however that death occurred. But even without answers, the story has meaning. It's a story about how ordinary people face extraordinary evil, how communities respond to terror, how investigators persist despite failure, how families endure loss, how society balances the need for answers with the acceptance that some answers may never come. It's also a story about the danger of giving evil what it wants. The Zodiac craved attention, and he received it in abundance. He wanted to be remembered, and he is. But the attention and remembrance have not given him what he sought. He wanted to be someone, but remains no one. He wanted power, but achieved only notoriety. He wanted slaves, but created only questions. The real power belongs to those who survived, who investigated, who remembered, who refused to let evil have the final word. Every person who wore a Zodiac button as defiance rather than compliance. Every investigator who kept working despite dead ends. Every family member who kept their loved one's memory alive. Every person who chose love over fear, life over death, light over darkness. The Zodiac may never be identified, but his victims will never be forgotten. Their lights, brief as they were, outshine his darkness. Their stories, interrupted though they were, are more complete than his will ever be. They were known, are known, will always be known. He was unknown, is unknown, will always be unknown. In the end, that's its own form of justice. Imperfect, unsatisfying, but real. The Zodiac failed in his ultimate goal. He didn't become someone. He remained no one, a shadow, a question mark, a void. His victims, by contrast, were someone, are someone, will always be someone. They won by being remembered as themselves. He lost by being remembered as nothing but mystery. The case remains open. The questions remain unanswered. The mystery persists. But so does memory. So does love. So does the human refusal to let evil define us. The Zodiac wrote his letters in blood, but we write the final chapter in remembrance, in resilience, in the insistence that light ultimately defeats darkness, even if that victory comes slowly, incompletely, over decades of patient endurance. Somewhere in the vast collection of evidence, in the memories of witnesses, in the dedication of investigators, in the love of families, truth waits. Whether it will ever be revealed is unknown, but the search continues, and in that continuation is meaning. Not the meaning the Zodiac intended, not fear, not servitude, not immortality through infamy, but meaning nonetheless. The meaning we create through remembering, through caring, through refusing to forget. The Zodiac claimed he would become immortal through his crimes, that his victims would serve him forever. But immortality isn't claimed through violence. It's earned through love, through being remembered fondly, through leaving the world better than you found it. The Zodiac's victims achieved that immortality. They are remembered with love. Their deaths made the world more vigilant, more careful, more aware of both evil and good. They serve no one in death, but continue to serve the living through the lessons their lives and deaths teach. Lessons about the preciousness of life, the importance of love, the need for justice, the value of persistence, the power of memory. They teach us these lessons not through their deaths, but through having lived, having been loved, having mattered. The darkness the Zodiac brought to Northern California in 1968 has never fully lifted. It lingers in the unsolved ciphers, the unidentified killer, the unanswered questions. But darkness, no matter how deep, cannot extinguish light. And the light of the victims, David's gentle smile, Betty Lou's tenderness, Darlene's laugh, Cecilia's ambition, Paul's determination, continues to shine through the darkness. That light is reflected in everyone who remembers them, who works for justice on their behalf, who refuses to let their stories end with their deaths. It's reflected in the investigators still working the case, the families still seeking answers, the communities still healing. It's reflected in everyone who chooses love over fear, life over death, remembrance over forgetting. The Zodiac wanted to write the ending to this story. He wanted it to end with him triumphant, feared, served by slaves in his imaginary paradise. But he doesn't get to write the ending. We do. And we choose to end not with him but with them, the ones who were lost, the ones who survived, the ones who remember. We end with David and Betty Lou on a December night, young and in love, their whole lives ahead of them. With Darlene laughing in a restaurant, bringing joy to everyone around her. With Cecilia planning her teaching career, imagining the students she would inspire. With Paul driving through San Francisco, working toward a better future. We end with them alive, vital, full of possibility. Because that's who they were before they became victims. That's who they remain in the memories of those who loved them. That's who they will always be, long after the Zodiac's name, whatever it was, is forgotten. They are the ones who matter. They are the ones we remember. They are the reason this story, dark as it is, ultimately speaks not of evil, but of good. Not of death, but of life. Not of ending, but of continuation. The Zodiac is shadow. They are light. And light, no matter how briefly it shines, leaves an impression that darkness can never erase. That's the real ending to this story. Not mystery unsolved, but memory preserved. Not justice denied, but love sustained. Not questions unanswered, but lives remembered. Thank you for spending this night with MurderLullaby. If you're still awake, thank you for sharing this night with me. And if you've drifted off to sleep, may your dreams be calm and your thoughts quiet.